Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Rebecca Thornfield, but everyone calls me Becky. I've been a park ranger here in the Great Smoky Mountains for 19 years. I've seen bears attack campers, watched people fall off cliffs, and pulled more lost hikers out of the woods than I can count. But I never believed in mountain devils until I found the Bone Throne. It was October 1987, and the leaves were burning bright orange and red across the mountains. The kind of fall that brings tourists from all over the country. That's when the Martinez family went missing. They were from Florida. Mom, Dad, and twin boys about 8 years old. Good campers, too. Had all the right gear, followed all the rules. They'd gotten permits to camp near Cataract Falls, way back in the deep woods where most folks don't go. 12 miles from the nearest road, no cell towers, just you and the mountains. When they didn't check out on time, dispatch sent me to look. I've got a PhD in ecology from UT, and I know these woods like my own backyard. If anyone could find them, it was me. I grabbed my radio, GPS, and bear spray, then headed up the old logging road in my truck. The Cherokee used to call this area the place where spirits dwell. I always figured that was just old stories. The kind of thing you tell tourists to make the mountains sound more mysterious. Should have listened to those old stories. The trail to Cataract Falls winds through some of the oldest trees in the park. Hemlocks that were here before Columbus. The kind of quiet that makes you feel small. But as I hiked deeper, something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized what it was. No birds, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the trail and my own breathing. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. Made a note in my logbook. Sometimes animals go quiet before storms, but the sky was clear. Their campsite was 2 miles further up the hollow. When I found it, my blood went cold. 4 tents, set up in a perfect circle around a cold fire pit. Sleeping bags still rolled out neat and tidy. Food hanging properly in the bear cables. Coffee pot sitting on the camp stove like they'd just stepped away for a minute. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. Their boots were lined up outside each tent, all pointing toward the center of the circle. Like they'd all walked out of their shoes at the exact same time, all facing the same direction. I called it in on my radio, but got nothing but static. GPS was acting weird too, showing readings that put me 1,000 feet higher than I knew I was. Even my compass was spinning like a carnival ride. I took pictures of everything, bagged some evidence, then started looking for tracks. Found them about 50 yards from camp, heading deeper into the woods. But these weren't normal footprints. They were huge. 18-inch stride, and they had 6 toes. The tracks led toward an old Cherokee burial ground I knew about. Park Service kept it quiet, out of respect. But local folks had been leaving tobacco and small offerings there for generations. Said it kept the old spirits happy. As I followed the tracks, the woods got darker, thicker. The hemlocks grew so close together they blocked out most of the sky. And that smell hit me, sweet decay mixed with pine. Like something had died and was slowly rotting under all those pretty fall leaves. That's when I heard it. Low and deep, coming from 3 different directions at once. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, something that made every animal instinct in my body scream, run. Instead, I did what rangers do. I radioed for backup and kept going. Big mistake. By the time Bill McKenzie reached my location, the sun was getting low. Bill was a senior ranger, 25 years in the park, and about the only person I trusted completely in these mountains. He brought dogs and a portable radio booster. "What we got, Becky?" he asked, looking at my photos of the campsite. I showed him the tracks. Bill was part Cherokee himself, grew up hearing the old stories from his grandmother. When he saw those 6-toed prints, his face went pale. "Aw, hell," he muttered. "How big you think this thing is?" "Based on stride length? At least 8 feet tall, maybe more." The dogs were acting strange. 3 German shepherds, all trained for search and rescue. They'd whine and pull toward the burial ground, then suddenly back away, hackles up, refusing to go any further. Never seen anything like it. We decided to split up, cover more ground before dark. Bill would take the lower trail toward the falls. I'd follow the tracks toward the burial ground. We'd meet back at the campsite in 2 hours. I should have said no. Should have insisted we stay together, but I'd been doing this job for almost 20 years. I thought I could handle whatever was out there. The tracks led me through a grove of ancient trees, their trunks so wide it would take 4 people holding hands to circle them. Spanish moss hung down like curtains, and everything was covered in a thin layer of fog that hadn't been there an hour before. That's when I found the first one. A deer. White-tailed doe, about 2 years old. She was hanging upside down from a low branch, gutted clean. But here's what made my hands shake. She'd been arranged, positioned, like some kind of offering. 20 yards further, I found another one, then another. All hung at exactly the same height, all facing the same direction, all pointing toward the burial ground. My radio crackled, Bill's voice full of static. "Becky, you need to see this." The signal cut out. I tried calling back, but got nothing. The fog was getting thicker, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. My breath was making little clouds, and I could feel ice crystals forming on my jacket. In October. In Tennessee, I followed the creek that led toward Bill's position, using my flashlight even though it wasn't quite dark yet. The fog made everything look gray and strange. Trees seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Found Bill's radio first, smashed to pieces against a rock, then his hat, then his backpack. Torn open, contents scattered everywhere. No sign of Bill. But the tracks were there. Those same 6-toed prints, only now there were smaller ones too. Human-sized, but wrong somehow. Like people walking on their toes. I followed them to Cataract Falls. The water was low for October, barely a trickle coming over the rocks. But at the base of the falls, I found something that made me forget all about protocol. Bones. Lots of them, arranged in a chair-like pattern against the rock wall. Old bones, yellow with age, but picked clean. And sitting on top of the pile, like a crown, was a massive set of antlers. Bigger than any deer I'd ever seen. Fresh flowers were scattered around the base, wildflowers that shouldn't be blooming in October. That's when I heard the voice. Deep and hollow, like wind through a cave. "You shouldn't have come here, daughter of thorns." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Nothing there, just shadows and mist. "The Martinez family," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are they?" Laughter echoed from everywhere and nowhere. Then silence. My flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, I could hear something moving. Something big, crashing through the underbrush. Getting closer, I ran, stumbled through the fog, using the sound of running water to guide me back toward the trail. Behind me, that horrible laughter followed. And footsteps, heavy ones, gaining ground. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me. The fog seemed to push against me like thick soup. But somehow, I made it back to the Martinez campsite. Bill was there, sitting by their cold fire pit, his back to me. "Bill," I gasped. "Thank God. We need to get out of here. Radio for help." He didn't move. "Bill?" I walked around to face him. His eyes were gone, just empty sockets, black in the moonlight. His mouth was open in a silent scream, but he was still breathing. I backed away from Bill, my heart hammering against my ribs. He just sat there, empty eye sockets pointed at the fire pit, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, like he was sleeping with his eyes open, except he didn't have eyes anymore. "Bill," I whispered. "Can you hear me?" His head turned toward my voice. Slowly, too slowly, like his neck was rusty. That's when I saw them. Shapes moving in the fog around the campsite, tall and thin, walking on their toes. The missing family. Mr. Martinez stepped into the firelight first. Same empty sockets, same silent scream. Behind him came his wife, then the twin boys, all walking in that awful slow way, like puppets on strings. They formed a circle around me, just standing there, waiting. "What do you want?" I called out to the darkness. The answer came from above. Something was perched in the big oak tree over the campsite. I could see its outline against the stars. Massive, with that crown of antlers spreading 10 feet across. "This is my hollow," it said in that voice like wind through caves. "My sacred place. Your kind has forgotten the old agreements. It dropped from the tree and landed without a sound. 12 feet tall, easy, covered in bark-like skin that seemed to shift and move in the moonlight. Those yellow eyes burned like lanterns in a skull that was part human, part deer, part something else entirely. The Hollow King, the Cherokee knew, it continued. They brought offerings, tobacco, food, respect. But your people come with their loud machines and bright lights. They take and give nothing back. I tried to think. My training kicked in. When dealing with aggressive wildlife, you stay calm, make yourself small. Back away slowly. But this wasn't wildlife. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't know. No one told me about the agreements. It laughed. Not the horrible echo from before, but something sadder. Almost human. 19 years you've walked my woods. 19 years of permits and rules and regulations. But you never asked permission from the one who was here first. The puppet people started moving closer. Bill reached out toward me with fingers that bent the wrong way. What happened to them? They're mine now. Their eyes see what I want them to see. Their feet walk where I want them to walk. They're part of the forest forever. I felt my back hit a tree. Nowhere left to run. The Cherokee elder in town, I said desperately. She still brings offerings, doesn't she? Mrs. White Dove. She knows the old ways. The Hollow King tilted its massive head. You know Sarah White Dove? She helped me once. When I was new here. Taught me which plants the bears eat, which trails flood in spring. She said the mountains remember everything. For a moment, the puppet people stopped moving. Even Bill's empty face turned toward the Hollow King. Sarah remembers, it said slowly. She brings tobacco every new moon, asks permission before she gathers medicine plants. She knows the price of taking from the sacred places. I want to know too, I said. Teach me. I'll make sure others know. No more camping here without permission. No more taking without giving back. The Hollow King stared down at me with those burning eyes. I could smell it now, earth and rot and growing things. The smell of the forest floor after rain. You would do this? Become a guardian instead of just a ranger? I nodded, not trusting my voice. There is always a price, daughter of thorns. Knowledge requires sacrifice. It reached out with one massive hand and touched my forehead. Pain shot through my skull like lightning. Images flashed behind my eyes. Centuries of history, Cherokee ceremonies, settlers cutting down sacred groves, tourists leaving trash, rangers who came before me and learned to see beyond the surface. When the vision ended, I was on my knees in the dirt. My left eye felt strange. When I touched it, my fingers came away bloody. Now you see with one foot in each world, the Hollow King said. You'll know when the sacred places are threatened. You'll feel it like a splinter in your mind. Bill and the Martinez family had stopped moving entirely. They stood like statues around the dead fire. What about them? They chose to take without asking. They must stay. But they're not in pain. They're part of something larger now, part of the eternal forest. The fog was lifting. Dawn was coming, painting the sky gray and pink through the trees. Go, the Hollow King said. Tell your supervisors the family fell into the underground river system. Tell them the caves are too dangerous to search. Close this hollow to camping. And if they don't listen, those yellow eyes flashed. Then more will join my guardians. It turned and walked into the mist, taking Bill and the Martinez family with it. In seconds, they were gone like they'd never been there. I was alone with the cold ashes of their campfire and the memory of that touch on my forehead. Getting back to park headquarters took me 6 hours. My GPS worked fine now, radio too. Like whatever had been interfering was gone. But my left eye kept showing me things that weren't there. Shadows moving between trees. Faces in the bark. The mountains watching. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Patricia Wells, listened to my report with that polite expression that meant she thought I'd hit my head on a rock. Underground river system, she repeated. And you're sure they fell in? Cave-in blocked the passage. I lied. Would take a full excavation team weeks to clear it. Probably never recover the bodies. She made notes. Asked about my eye. I told her I'd caught a branch while running back for help. Standard hiking injury. The hollow got closed to camping. Geological instability, they called it on the official report. I made sure the signs were posted good and proper. No camping, no overnight stays. Day hiking only with permits. But I knew that wasn't enough. 3 days later, I drove into Cherokee and found Mrs. White Dove at her daughter's shop. She was stringing beads, her old hands still steady despite her 70-plus years. "Becky Thornfield," she said without looking up. "You met him, didn't you?" I sat down across from her. "How did you know?" She gestured at my left eye. "Still bloodshot, still seeing things differently. That's his mark. Means you're a bridge now, between the modern world and the old ways." He said, "You've been making offerings every new moon for 40 years. Since my grandmother passed and left me the responsibility." She finally looked at me. "Tobacco, mostly. Sometimes cornmeal, always with proper prayers, always asking permission. Will you teach me?" Mrs. White Dove smiled. "Already started, child. The moment you asked instead of demanding, she taught me the Cherokee words for requesting safe passage. Showed me how to prepare the tobacco, how to approach sacred places with respect. Most importantly, she taught me to listen. The mountains talk," she said, "but most people stopped listening generations ago. They think they own the land instead of borrowing it." I started making the offerings myself. Every new moon, just like Mrs. White Dove showed me. And once a month, I'd hike up to the hollow, not to the burial ground. That was too sacred for regular visits. But to the edge, where I could leave tobacco and sage, and feel the Hollow King's presence like electricity in the air. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of Bill through my marked eye. He looked peaceful, walking ancient paths with the Martinez family, part of something bigger than himself now. Other rangers started noticing changes. Wildlife seemed more active around me. Bears that should have been aggressive stayed calm. Lost hikers somehow always ended up on trails that led back to me, like the mountains were helping. I never told anyone the real story. Who would believe it? But I made sure other rangers knew about Cherokee sacred sites. Started requiring cultural sensitivity training for all backcountry permits. Brought Mrs. White Dove in to teach proper protocols for the old burial grounds. The missing person reports dropped to almost nothing in my sector. Word got around among the local Cherokee community. There was finally a park ranger who understood the old agreements. But every October, when the leaves turned and tourists came looking for the perfect camping spot, I had to be extra careful. That's when the Hollow King grew restless. When the boundary between worlds got thin, that was 37 years ago. I retired from the Park Service in 2019, but I still make the offerings, still keep watch. My left eye never went back to normal. Doctors call it nerve damage from the branch that hit me. But I know better. Through that eye, I can see the Hollow King's realm overlapping with ours. The sacred places glow with soft light. The spirits of the land move like smoke between the trees. And sometimes, in the deepest woods, I catch sight of my old partner Bill, still walking his eternal patrol. The Park Service has changed a lot over the years. New technology, new procedures. But they still ask me to consult on backcountry incidents, especially when campers go missing in the old-growth areas. Most of the time, it's simple stuff. People getting turned around, following game trails instead of marked paths. But sometimes I have to make the drive up to Cherokee, buy tobacco from Mrs. White Dove's granddaughter, Sarah, passed in 2003, may she rest in peace, and have a conversation with something that was old when the first Cherokee walked these mountains. The agreement still holds. Respect the sacred places, ask permission, give offerings, and the mountains will keep you safe. But try to take what isn't freely given, camp where you shouldn't, disturb what should be left alone. Well, the forest has many guardians now. 3 weeks ago, a family from California went missing near Cataract Falls. Their permits were for a different area entirely, but they'd decided to explore on their own. By the time I got the call, they'd been missing for 2 days. I found their campsite arranged in a perfect circle, boots pointing toward the center, 6-toed tracks leading toward the burial ground. The Hollow King is patient, but he's not forgiving, and the forest remembers everything. If you ever find yourself camping in old-growth wilderness, especially here in the Smokies, remember this: you're never alone out there. The mountains are watching, the trees are listening, and some guardians have been keeping watch a lot longer than any park ranger. Leave offerings of tobacco if you know how. Ask permission before you take so much as a wildflower. Respect the silence of sacred places. And if you hear something moving in the woods at night, something too big to be a bear, too quiet to be human, don't go looking for it. Sometimes it's better to stay in your tent and wait for morning. Trust me on this one. My name is Danny Mountainheart, and I've been a park ranger at Monongahela National Forest for 16 years. In all that time, I've handled over 200 climbing accidents on these West Virginia cliffs. Broken bones, heart attacks, equipment failures, you name it, I've seen it. But I never believed in banshees until I heard them calling names from the rocks. Let me tell you about Seneca Rocks. These aren't your ordinary cliffs. They shoot straight up 900 feet from the valley floor, made of sandstone that's older than dinosaurs. The Tuscarora Formation, we call it 440 million years old. On a clear day, you can see these white limestone towers from 20 miles away. The local Seneca Indians used to come here for vision quests. They called this place where the screaming winds live. I always figured that was just about the weather. These cliffs create their own wind patterns, sudden updrafts that can knock you sideways without warning. Makes sense that ancient people would think spirits lived here. I got into this job after my army days, did 2 tours overseas, came back looking for something that mattered. Found it in these mountains. There's something pure about helping people who push their limits on real rock. These aren't gym climbers. The folks who come to Seneca are serious. They tackle routes with names like Cons West and Old Ladies Route, grades that separate the weekend warriors from the real deal. My specialty is technical rescue. When someone gets stuck 300 feet up a vertical wall, I'm the guy who goes to get them. I know every route on the North Peak by heart, every handhold, every crack, every place where the rock gets loose. I can climb 5.1 routes with a full rescue pack and enough gear to haul up a grown man. The work keeps me sharp. Has to, when people's lives depend on your skills. I lost my climbing partner Jake 3 years ago to what the investigation called equipment failure. His rope snapped at exactly 150 feet. Brand new rope, rated for thousands of pounds. Sometimes gear just fails, they said. It happens. But Jake was careful. More careful than anyone I knew. He checked everything twice, tested every piece before he trusted his life to it. When I found him at the bottom of that cliff, something felt wrong. Not just the sadness, the wrongness went deeper than grief. That was my first hint that these mountains held secrets I didn't understand. The climbing season runs from April through October, but August is when we get the most action. Hot days, long daylight, perfect conditions for big wall climbing. That's when the serious climbers come to test themselves against routes that have humbled experts for decades. This year felt different from the start. The peregrine falcons that nest on the cliff faces were acting strange. These birds have nested here for thousands of years, but in July they all just left. Every nest abandoned, baby birds and all. In 30 years of watching wildlife, I'd never seen anything like it. The weather was weird too. Sudden thunderstorms with no warning from the weather service. One minute you'd have clear skies. The next minute you're getting hammered by winds that seem to come from inside the rock itself. The storms always hit the North Peak hardest, like something was calling them there. But what really got my attention was the reports from the climbing club. 3 different groups, all experienced climbers, all reported hearing human screams coming from impossible locations on the cliff face. Not the usual sounds of climbers in trouble. These were screams of pure terror, coming from spots where no human being could possibly be. The first report came from Maria Santos, a climbing instructor from Richmond. She was leading a group up the South Peak when she heard what sounded like a woman screaming from inside the north face. Not from a ledge or a root, from inside the solid rock wall itself. It wasn't an echo, she told me, hands shaking as she filled out the incident report. It was like the rock was screaming, and it knew my name. It called Maria 3 times, getting louder each time. I figured it was just the wind. These cliffs play tricks with sound. Climbers hear all sorts of things when they're 300 feet off the deck, with nothing but air beneath them. Fear can make your mind create sounds that aren't there. But then Tom Bradley came to see me. Tom's been climbing these rocks for 20 years. He's the kind of guy who stays calm when everyone else is panicking. If Tom says he heard something, I listen. "Danny, something's not right up there," he said, pointing toward the North Peak. I was halfway up Cons East Direct when I heard Jake calling for help. Clear as day, your old partner's voice, yelling for rescue. But Jake's been dead 3 years, man. And the voice was coming from above me, not below. That's when I knew I had to take this seriously. Because Tom was right about one thing. Jake's voice was unmistakable. I'd heard it on dozens of climbs, always calm and steady, even in the worst situations. If someone was mimicking Jake's voice to mess with climbers, that wasn't just dangerous, it was cruel. What I didn't know yet was that something had been hunting in these rocks for a very long time, something that knew every climber who'd ever died on these walls, something that was getting hungry again. The first body turned up on a Tuesday morning in mid-August. I got the call at 6 a.m. from dispatch. Climber down on the north face, approximately 400 feet up. Standard rescue protocol kicked in automatically. I grabbed my gear and headed for the base of the cliff with my partner Susan Dalton. Susan's the best technical climber on our team. She's small but strong, with 20 years of rescue experience. More importantly, she keeps her head when things go sideways. If I had to trust someone to haul me off a cliff face, Susan would be my first choice. We reached the base and looked up. Even with binoculars, it took us 10 minutes to spot the body. David Chen, a software engineer from DC who'd been climbing here for 5 years. Good climber, always followed safety protocols. He was hanging about 300 feet up, suspended from his rope in a harness. That's not the route he was supposed to be on, Susan said, studying the cliff face. He signed in for Old Man's route, but he's hanging on Khan's West Direct. That's 2 grade levels harder than anything David ever climbed. We started our ascent, standard rescue approach. I led with the gear while Susan followed with the medical kit. It should have been a straightforward recovery. David was clearly dead, had been for hours, based on the condition of his body, but we still had to bring him down safely. Halfway up, I found something that made my stomach clench. David's chalk bag was sitting on a ledge 20 feet below his body, not dropped, placed. Neatly positioned like someone had set it down carefully. But David was hanging above us. How does your chalk bag end up below you unless someone else put it there? Susan, you see this? I called down. She climbed up to examine the bag. Her face went pale. Danny, look at the rope. David's climbing rope was a brand new dynamic line, rated for over 8,000 pounds of force. But it had snapped at exactly 150 feet from his harness. The same length where Jake's rope had failed 3 years ago. The break wasn't frayed or worn. It looked like it had been cut, but there were no tool marks. Just a clean separation, like the rope had simply decided to stop being rope at that exact spot. How did he get up here? Susan asked, studying the cliff face. There's no way to reach this spot from Old Man's route. He'd have to climb straight up an overhanging wall with no protection. David wasn't good enough for that. I didn't have an answer. The more we looked, the less sense it made. David's gear was perfectly placed, exactly the way an expert would set protection for this route. But David had never climbed anything harder than 5.7, and this was a 5.1 wall. It would be like asking someone who'd never driven a race car to suddenly win the Indianapolis 500. We got the body down without incident, but the whole descent felt wrong. The wind kept shifting in ways that didn't match the weather patterns I'd learned in 16 years on these cliffs. Sometimes it felt like something was watching us work. The real shock came when we examined David's gear at the base. Every piece of protection he'd placed was perfect. Not just good, perfect. The kind of placement you see from climbers with decades of experience. Each cam was set at exactly the right angle. Every nut was positioned in the strongest part of the crack. Danny, this doesn't make sense, Susan said, holding up one of David's cams. Look at this placement. This is master-level technique. David couldn't have done this, but someone had. Someone with incredible skill had helped David climb to a spot where he couldn't survive, then watched him fall. The medical examiner's report raised even more questions. David had died from the fall, but there were other marks on his body. Scratches on his arms and face that looked almost like claw marks. Deep gouges that had torn through his climbing shirt and into the skin beneath. Could be from the rock, the examiner said. Sometimes when people fall, they scrape against the cliff face. But these are unusually deep and regular. Almost like an animal attack. I didn't mention that there were no animals on Seneca rocks big enough or strong enough to make marks like that. The largest predators in the area were bobcats, and they don't climb vertical cliff faces. 3 days later, we found the second body. Sarah Mitchell, a nurse from Pittsburgh, and an experienced traditional climber. She was discovered hanging upside down from her rope, suspended about 200 feet up the Grand Traverse. But here's the thing. Sarah was found higher on the cliff than any human being could have climbed to. The route she was on dead-ended at a blank wall about 50 feet below where we found her. "It's impossible," Susan said, staring up at Sarah's body through the binoculars. "There's no way to reach that spot. It's a completely smooth wall, with no cracks, no holds, nothing. You'd need to fly to get there." This time, the rope hadn't broken. Sarah was still attached to her climbing line, which stretched down the cliff face to her last piece of protection. But the rope was tangled in ways that defied physics. It was twisted around outcroppings that were 10 feet away from the main climbing line, wrapped through cracks that were too small for a human hand to reach. When we reached Sarah's body, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the rock next to where she hung was a single word: Danny. Not carved with a tool. Scratched, like someone had dragged their fingernails across solid stone hard enough to leave permanent marks. The letters were 3 inches deep in sandstone that takes thousands of years to erode naturally. "Susan, tell me you see this too," I said, pointing to the scratches. She stared at the marks for a long time before answering. "I see it, but I don't understand it. Who could scratch letters in solid rock? And why would they know your name?" That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jake's accident 3 years ago, about the way his rope had snapped at exactly the same length as David's, about the perfect gear placements that David couldn't have made, about Sarah hanging in a spot no climber could reach, and about my name scratched into the stone like a message. The next morning brought the third body, and that's when I knew we were dealing with something that wasn't human. Marcus Webb was a mountain guide from Colorado, the kind of climber who'd done big walls all over the world. El Capitan, the Eiger, peaks in the Himalayas. Marcus had climbed them all. If anyone could handle the technical challenges of Seneca Rocks, it was him. We found him on Thursday morning, and the sight made Susan throw up right there on the cliff face. Marcus was embedded in the rock wall. Not hanging from it, not lying against it, embedded. His body was somehow pushed into the solid stone face of the North Peak, like someone had pressed him into wet concrete that had then hardened around him. Only his head and one arm were sticking out from the cliff face. "This isn't possible," Susan kept saying, as we rappelled down to examine the body. "Rock doesn't work this way. You can't push a person into solid stone." But there he was. The sandstone around Marcus looked normal. No cracks, no signs of disturbance. It was as if he had always been part of the cliff face, like a fossil that had somehow appeared overnight. The worst part was his expression. Marcus died terrified, his face frozen in a scream of absolute horror. His eyes were wide open, staring at something only he could see. His mouth was stretched so wide it looked like his jaw had been dislocated. I'd seen plenty of climbing accident victims, but this was different. This wasn't the look of someone who'd fallen or gotten injured. This was the face of someone who'd seen something so terrible it had literally scared him to death. "Danny, look at this," Susan called from above. She was examining Marcus's gear, which was still hanging from the cliff face 20 feet above where we found his body. His rope is cut clean through. But look at the placement of his protection. I climbed up to see what she'd found. Marcus's cams and nuts were placed in a perfect line up the cliff face, each one positioned with impossible precision. But they weren't following any climbing route, I recognized. Instead, they formed a straight vertical line that led directly to a blank section of wall with no holds or cracks. "It's like he was being guided," Susan said quietly. Like something was showing him exactly where to place his gear, leading him up to that spot. The gear placements were so perfect they looked almost decorative, like someone had been creating a pattern in the rock face. And at the top of the line, scratched into the stone above Marcus's highest piece of protection, were more letters. "Come higher." That afternoon, I called in the state police. This was beyond Park Service jurisdiction. 3 expert climbers don't die in impossible ways by accident. Someone or something was killing people on my mountain, and I needed help figuring out what. Detective Ray Kowalski arrived the next morning with a team of investigators. Ray was a good cop, thorough and smart, but he'd never spent time on vertical rock. He took one look at the cliff faces, and I could see him trying to figure out how to investigate crimes that happened 400 feet off the ground. "Walk me through this, Danny," he said, studying photographs of the 3 victims. "You're telling me these people died in ways that violate the laws of physics?" I explained about the impossible rope breaks, the perfect gear placements that the victims couldn't have made, the locations where the bodies were found. Ray listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small notebook. Could be equipment sabotage, he said finally. Someone tampering with gear, weakening ropes, that kind of thing. The question is motive. But Ray's theory didn't explain how David had climbed a route beyond his ability, or how Sarah had reached a spot no human could access, or how Marcus had been pressed into solid rock. Equipment sabotage couldn't account for the claw marks or the messages scratched in stone. That night, Susan and I volunteered to camp at the base of the cliffs. If someone was sabotaging climbers, we might be able to catch them in the act. We set up our gear in a small clearing that gave us a clear view of the main climbing routes. Around midnight, the wind started acting up. Not the usual mountain breezes, but sudden gusts that seemed to come from specific directions, like something was moving around the cliff faces. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes, which shouldn't happen in August. "You hear that?" Susan whispered. I listened. At first, just wind and the usual night sounds. Then I heard it, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, but deeper and more resonant. It was coming from high up on the north face, somewhere around the 400-foot level. The sound got louder, and I realized it was voices. Multiple voices, all screaming at once, but the screams were forming words. Names. I heard David and Sarah and Marcus being called out in voices that didn't sound human. "Danny, look up there," Susan said, pointing toward the cliff face. 400 feet above us, shapes were moving on the vertical rock wall. Not climbing, moving. Flowing across the stone like water, but in humanoid forms. They were too far away to make out details, but I could see they were large, much larger than normal people. The shapes were heading straight down the cliff face, moving faster than anything should be able to move on vertical rock. In less than a minute, they would reach the ground level where we were camped. "We need to go," I said, but Susan was already packing our gear. We made it to the truck just as the first shape reached the base of the cliff. In the beam of my flashlight, I got my first clear look at one of the things that had been hunting climbers. It stood 7 feet tall with arms that were too long and fingers that ended in claws. Its skin looked like rock, gray and textured, like the sandstone of the cliffs. But the worst part was its face, or what should have been its face. Instead of features, there was just a mouth full of teeth and 2 holes where eyes should be. The thing opened its mouth and let out a scream that felt like ice picks being driven into my skull. The sound was so loud and sharp that both our truck windows exploded. Susan's nose started bleeding from the pressure. Then it spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "Daniel Mountainheart, we have been waiting." That's when I understood that these things knew exactly who we were. They had been watching us, learning about us, preparing for this moment. We weren't dealing with random predators. This was personal. We drove straight to town and didn't stop until we reached the sheriff's station. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Susan sat in the passenger seat with a towel pressed to her nose, blood still trickling from her nostrils. "They knew my name," I kept saying. Whatever those things were, they knew my name. Sheriff Tom Brennan took one look at us and knew something serious had happened. Tom's been law enforcement in this county for 30 years. He's seen everything from drug labs to domestic violence, but this was outside his experience. "Sit down and tell me what happened," he said, pouring coffee with hands that were steadier than mine. I told him about the creatures on the cliff face, about the impossible deaths, about the voices calling names in the dark. Tom listened without interrupting, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. 2 park rangers coming in at 1 a.m. talking about monsters wasn't exactly standard police business. "Danny, you've been under a lot of stress with these climbing accidents," Tom said carefully. "Maybe you and Susan should take some time off. Let the state investigators handle this." Before I could answer, his radio crackled with an emergency call. Another climber in distress on the north face, approximately 300 feet up. A woman's voice screaming for help. "That's impossible," Susan said, checking her watch. "It's 1:30 in the morning. Nobody climbs these routes at night." But the emergency call was real. The voice on the radio was clear and desperate, calling for immediate rescue. Tom looked at us with new understanding. Whatever was happening on those cliffs was still active. "I'll call in the state police helicopter," Tom said, reaching for his phone. "No," I said, standing up. "Those things are still up there. If we send aircraft, people are going to die. I need to go up myself." "Like hell you do," Susan said. "Those creatures nearly killed us an hour ago." But I was already thinking about the gear in my truck. Full rescue kit, enough rope for a 400-foot rappel, headlamp, and radio. If there was really someone alive on that cliff, I was the only one with the skills to reach them safely. "There's something else," I said to Tom. "I need to talk to Joseph Crowfeather." Joseph was a Seneca elder who lived about 10 miles up the valley. His grandfather had been one of the last traditional medicine men of the tribe, and Joseph still maintained the old ways. If anyone knew the real history of these cliffs, it would be him. Tom made the call. 20 minutes later, Joseph arrived at the sheriff's station, driving a pickup truck that was older than I was. He looked exactly like what you'd expect from a Seneca elder. Weathered face, long gray hair, eyes that seemed to see more than they should. But there was something else in his expression, recognition. "The cliff guardians are hunting again," he said before anyone explained why he was there. "I felt them wake up 3 days ago." Joseph sat down across from us and folded his hands on the table. "My grandfather told me this day would come. The spirits that guard the Vision Quest sites were bound by treaties made long ago, but white people have forgotten how to approach sacred places with respect." "Vision Quest sites?" I asked. "The cliffs where young warriors would go to seek their spirit animals," Joseph explained. "Dangerous places, high and isolated, where the boundary between the physical and spirit worlds is thin. The cliff guardians were appointed to protect these sites and test those who sought visions." "Test them how?" Susan asked. Joseph's expression darkened. "By making them prove their courage and spiritual worthiness. Those who approached with respect and understanding were granted safe passage. Those who came with arrogance or greed." He gestured toward the window, where the cliffs were visible in the distance. "They became part of the rock forever." The radio crackled again, the woman's voice still calling for help, but weaker now, more desperate. "I have to go up there," I said. "If there's someone alive—" "There isn't," Joseph interrupted. "That voice belongs to Sarah Mitchell. The cliff guardians are using her spirit to lure more climbers. They're calling you specifically because you've been interfering with their hunting." The room went silent. Sarah Mitchell had been dead for 4 days. "Then how do I stop them?" I asked. Joseph studied my face for a long moment. "There is a way, but it requires you to complete what your people call a vision quest. You must climb to the sacred site at the top of the north face and ask the guardians for safe passage. If they judge you worthy, they will return to their sleep. And if they don't judge me worthy—" Joseph's smile was not encouraging. "Then you join the others in the rock." But the emergency calls kept coming. Every few minutes, another voice on the radio, Marcus Webb calling for rescue, David Chen screaming for help. Even Jake's voice, my dead climbing partner, begging me to come save him. The cliff guardians were using the voices of everyone who had died on these rocks to draw more victims. And the calls were getting stronger, more compelling. I could feel them pulling at something deep in my mind, creating an almost irresistible urge to climb toward those voices. They're not going to stop, I realized. As long as people keep climbing here, the guardians will keep hunting. The only way to end this is to face them directly. Susan grabbed my arm. "Danny, this is insane. You're talking about climbing alone at night to meet creatures that have killed 4 people. 5 people, I corrected, thinking about Jake. They've been killing climbers for years. We just never recognized the pattern." Joseph stood up and walked to the window. "The sacred site is at the top of the route your people call Khan's West Direct. It's a difficult climb, even in daylight with proper equipment. At night, alone, it's nearly impossible." "Nearly," I said, "but not completely." Joseph nodded slowly. "If you choose this path, you must follow the old protocols. No artificial light above the halfway point. The guardians see this as disrespectful. No metal gear in the final 100 feet, only natural protection. And you must carry an offering." "What kind of offering?" "Something that represents your connection to this place. Something that shows you understand the sacred nature of what you're doing." I knew immediately what I had to bring. Jake's climbing harness, the one he'd been wearing when he died. I'd kept it all these years, unable to throw it away. If the cliff guardians wanted to judge my worthiness, they could start by understanding what these mountains had already cost me. An hour before dawn, I stood at the base of the north face with Joseph's blessings and the weight of Jake's harness in my pack. The emergency calls had stopped, but I could feel eyes watching me from high above. The cliff guardians knew I was coming. Time to find out if I was worthy to survive. The climb started normally. I'd done Khan's West Direct dozens of times in daylight, and my hands knew every hold by touch. The first 200 feet went smoothly, following the crack system that splits the lower face of the North Peak. But as I climbed higher, the rock itself began to feel different. Warmer than it should be in the pre-dawn cold. Sometimes the handhold seemed to shift slightly under my fingers, like the stone was alive and breathing. At the halfway point, I turned off my headlamp as Joseph had instructed. The darkness was absolute, but somehow I could still see the route ahead of me. The rock seemed to glow faintly, outlining the crack system and showing me where to place my hands and feet. That's when I heard Jake's voice for the first time. "Danny, what are you doing up here?" Clear as day, coming from somewhere above me. The same tone he'd used 1,000 times during our climbing partnership, calm, steady, but with a hint of concern. I almost answered before remembering Joseph's warning. The guardians would try to distract me with familiar voices. I focused on the climb and kept moving upward. At 300 feet, I reached the spot where I had to switch to natural protection only. No more metal cams or nuts, just natural features of the rock and old-style climbing techniques. I removed my gear harness and stuffed it into my pack, keeping only the ropes I needed for safety. The climbing got harder immediately. Without modern protection, every move carried the risk of a fatal fall. But the route seemed to guide me upward, showing me holds I'd never noticed in all my previous climbs. It was like the rock wanted me to reach the top. "You don't have to do this," Jake's voice said again, closer now. "Turn around, Danny. Come down while you still can." I looked up and saw him. Jake, exactly as he'd looked 3 years ago on our last climb together. Same gear, same clothes, even the same concerned expression he'd worn when I'd pushed too hard on difficult routes. But his eyes were wrong. Instead of Jake's warm brown eyes, there were empty holes that seemed to go deeper than they should. And when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too many. "That's not Jake," I said out loud, and the false image flickered like a bad television signal. The thing wearing Jake's form hissed in frustration. "You cannot reach the sacred site. Turn back now, or join your friend in the stone." "Where is Jake really?" I demanded. The creature's smile widened impossibly. "Feel the rock beside you." I pressed my palm against the cliff face and felt something that made my stomach lurch. The stone was warm and soft, like skin. And underneath the surface, I could feel movement. Heartbeats. Breathing. The cliff guardians hadn't just killed the climbers who died here over the years. They'd absorbed them into the rock itself, keeping them alive and aware, but trapped forever in stone. Jake was in there, along with David and Sarah and Marcus and dozens of others who died on these cliffs throughout history. "Let them go," I said. "Prove you are worthy," the creature replied. "Reach the sacred site. Face the judgment of the guardians. If you succeed, all will be freed." The final 100 feet were the hardest climbing I'd ever done, not because of the technical difficulty, but because the rock itself seemed to be fighting me. Handholds crumbled when I grabbed them. Footholds shifted and tried to dump me off the cliff face. The wind howled with voices of all the trapped climbers, begging me to turn back before it was too late. But I kept climbing, driven by the knowledge that Jake and all the others were counting on me. Whatever the cliff guardians wanted to see in me, whatever test they had planned, I had to pass it. I reached the top of the north face just as the sun came up over the valley. The sacred site was a small, flat area about 20 feet across, surrounded by standing stones that I'd never noticed from below. In the center of the circle was a fire pit with ashes that looked fresh, as if someone had been maintaining it for centuries. 3 figures stood waiting for me. They were shaped like humans, but made of living stone, their faces ancient and stern. These were the true cliff guardians, not the creatures that had been hunting climbers below. These beings radiated power and intelligence that made me feel like an insect in their presence. Daniel Mountainheart, the center figure, spoke without moving its lips. The words formed directly in my mind. "You have climbed to the sacred site. State your purpose." I pulled Jake's harness from my pack and held it out. "I've come to ask for the freedom of those you've trapped in the stone." They climbed here without understanding the sacred nature of this place. Their ignorance doesn't deserve eternal punishment. The 3 guardians examined Jake's harness with eyes that saw more than the physical object. They were reading the history contained in the worn nylon and metal buckles. Every climb Jake and I had shared, every moment of trust and partnership, Every time we'd kept each other safe on the rock. "You offer yourself in their place?" the guardian asked. "If that's what it takes." The guardians spoke among themselves in a language that sounded like wind through stone. Finally, the center figure nodded. "Your offering is accepted. Not your life, but your service. You will become the bridge between the climbers and the sacred places. You will teach them to approach with respect, and we will allow safe passage to those who prove worthy." The guardian reached out and touched my forehead with a finger made of stone. The contact sent images flooding into my mind. The true history of Seneca Rocks, the centuries of spiritual seekers who had climbed here safely because they understood what they were doing. The gradual corruption as recreational climbers began treating the cliffs as a playground instead of a sacred site. "Go," the guardian commanded. "Teach your people the old ways, or we will resume hunting." I rappelled down from the sacred site as the sun rose higher, and when I reached the 400-foot level, I saw them. Jake and David and Sarah and Marcus, stepping out of the cliff face like they were walking through a doorway. They looked confused but alive, real and solid again. "Danny," Jake said, staring at me in bewilderment. "How long was I?" "The last thing I remember is falling, and then everything went dark." The others were equally disoriented, with no memory of being trapped in the stone. As far as they knew, they'd just had climbing accidents and somehow survived. The medical explanations for their recoveries made no sense, but nobody questioned miracles too closely. That was 6 months ago. The climbing area is officially open again, but with new rules. Every climber who wants to tackle the North Face routes has to attend a cultural sensitivity briefing that I personally conduct. They learn about the Seneca Vision Quest traditions, about approaching sacred sites with respect, about the spiritual significance of the cliffs. Most people think it's just Park Service bureaucracy, but some understand. Those are the climbers who make it to the top safely, the ones who treat the mountain as a playground instead of a sacred site. Well, sometimes their ropes still break at exactly 150 feet. The cliff guardians are sleeping again, but their sleep is light. They're watching, always watching, to see if we've learned to be worthy of sharing their sacred spaces. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the light hits the cliff face at the perfect angle, I can still see faces in the stone, not trapped anymore, but watching, waiting, ready to protect this place from anyone who forgets that some mountains are more than just rock to be conquered. Jake climbs with me again sometimes. He doesn't remember being in the stone, but he approaches every route differently now, more carefully, with more respect. "There's something different about these cliffs," he told me last week. "Like they're alive somehow, like they're watching to see what kind of person you really are." I just smiled and handed him his gear. Some truths are too big for words, too dangerous to share with people who aren't ready to understand them. The mountains keep their secrets, and I keep mine, but I never climb alone anymore. Because I know now that in places like Seneca Rocks, you're never really alone anyway. The spirits are always with you, watching to see if you're worthy of the privilege of sharing their sacred spaces. And if you're not worthy, well, the rock is always hungry, and it has room for one more. My name is Margaret Ironwood, but everyone calls me Maggie. I've been a ranger at Monongahela National Forest for 21 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, illegal hunting, even a few meth labs hidden in the deep woods. But I never believed in necromancers until I found their bone cathedral. It was November 1979, and the first real cold snap had hit Dolly Sod's wilderness. The plateau sits high up in the mountains of West Virginia, where the wind cuts through you like a knife, and the stunted trees look like they're always reaching for help. Most folks avoid the area once winter starts, but that's exactly when I love it most. The silence up there is so complete, you can hear your own heartbeat. I've got a PhD in Appalachian history, spent years studying Civil War battlefields before I became a ranger. There's something about those old places that draws me in. The stories they tell. The way the past seems to hang in the air like morning mist. Dolly Sods has plenty of history. During the Civil War, Confederate and Union forces fought skirmishes all through these mountains. The 14th West Virginia Infantry lost 14 men in one battle near Breathed Mountain in November 1863. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave, unmarked and forgotten. That's why the archaeological team was there. Dr. Sarah Chen from the university had gotten permission to excavate what we thought was the burial site. Just routine work, catalog the remains, give those boys a proper memorial after all these years. Sarah's team had been up there for a week, setting up their grid system and carefully removing layers of acidic bog soil that had preserved everything like it was frozen in time. Then they went missing. I got the call on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was supposed to check in every 12 hours, but nobody had heard from her or her 3-person team for 5 days. The weather had been clear, no storms or sudden temperature drops that might have trapped them. Their base camp was only 8 miles from the nearest trail, an easy hike for experienced people. Probably just equipment failure, my supervisor said when he handed me the search assignment. Radio batteries die, you know how it is. But I knew Sarah Chen. She was the kind of person who carried backup batteries for her backup batteries. Something was wrong. I hiked up to their camp that afternoon, my boots crunching through the thin layer of snow that had fallen during the night. The November air was sharp and clean, the way it gets before a real storm moves in. Ravens called from the twisted trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the low moan of wind across the open plateau. The first thing I noticed was the smell, not decay, something else, sweet and heavy, like flowers left too long in a closed room. It hung around the excavation site like invisible fog, getting stronger as I got closer to where they'd been digging. Sarah's equipment was still there, shovels, brushes, the careful measuring tools archaeologists use. Her notebook lay open to the last entry, dated 5 days ago. Unusual bone arrangement discovered. Appears intentional, not random burial. Requesting extended excavation time. The dig site itself made my skin crawl. They'd uncovered what looked like the mass grave, all right, but the bones weren't scattered like you'd expect from soldiers dumped in a hurry. They were arranged, carefully placed in patterns that looked almost like architecture. Rib cages formed archways. Skulls were stacked like cornerstones. Leg bones created what could only be described as pillars. It looked like someone had built a church out of human remains. I called for backup on my radio, but all I got was static mixed with something that sounded like distant drumming. Maybe thunder, but the sky was clear. I tried again, adjusting the frequency, and for just a moment I could swear I heard voices singing. Old hymns, the kind my grandmother used to hum while she cooked. The temperature around the excavation site was wrong too. Even though snow covered the ground everywhere else, the dirt here was warm to the touch. Steam rose from the disturbed earth like breath on a cold morning. I should have left then. Should have hiked back down the mountain and gotten a full search team with proper equipment. But those 4 people were missing, and every hour that passed made their chances worse. So I made camp and decided to start looking for them in the morning. That night, lying in my sleeping bag 50 yards from the Bone Church, I heard the singing again. Clearer this time, drifting across the plateau like smoke. I recognized the tune, Amazing Grace, but the words were wrong. Instead of grace and redemption, the voices sang about rising up, about answering the call to march again. I didn't sleep much. Dawn came gray and cold, with mist rising from the bog like ghosts looking for somewhere to haunt. I made coffee on my camp stove and tried the radio again. Still nothing but that strange drumming sound, though now it seemed to have a rhythm to it, like soldiers marching. I decided to expand my search in a spiral pattern around the dig site, looking for any sign of where Sarah's team might have gone. The ground was soft and marshy in most places, perfect for holding tracks, but I couldn't find any footprints leading away from the excavation. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. 2 hours into my search, I found the first anomaly. A piece of equipment that definitely hadn't been there the day before. An old surveying instrument made of brass and dark wood. It looked like something from a museum, with hand-carved details and manual adjustment screws. But according to the serial number stamped on the base, it had been manufactured by the same company that made Sarah's modern tools. In 1863, I stared at that impossible date until my eyes watered, then checked it again. The numbers were clear, etched deep into the metal. I photographed everything and carefully placed the instrument in my backpack. Whatever was happening here, I needed evidence. The sweet flower smell was stronger today, concentrated around a section of the bone church I hadn't examined closely before. As I got nearer, I realized what I was looking at wasn't just arranged bones. It was a complete structure. Someone had built walls, doorways, even what looked like an altar, all from the remains of Civil War soldiers. And there were fresh bones mixed in with the old ones. I knew enough about forensic identification to recognize recent human remains when I saw them. These bones still had bits of tissue clinging to them, still showed the clear marks of sharp tools used to separate joints. Someone had butchered 4 people and added their bones to this grotesque construction. My hands were shaking as I took photographs. I'd seen violent death before. Car accidents, hunting accidents, even a few murders in my 21 years as a ranger. But this was something else. This was deliberate, ritualistic. That's when I heard Sarah's voice. "Maggie? Maggie? Is that you?" It came from inside the bone church, muffled but unmistakably her. I called back, but got no answer. Just silence, and that sweet, sickening smell. I approached the entrance, an archway made from interlocked femurs and skulls, and called again. "Sarah, where are you? Are you hurt?" "Down here," came the reply, fainter now. "We're down here. We need help." There was a hole in the ground at the center of the bone structure, about 3 feet wide and perfectly round. It dropped straight down into darkness, and Sarah's voice seemed to be coming from somewhere far below. I shone my flashlight into the opening, but the beam just disappeared into black nothing. "How deep are you?" I called down. "Deep," Sarah's voice echoed back. "So deep, but we're alive. All of us are alive down here." Something about her tone bothered me. Sarah was a tough woman, practical and no nonsense, but her voice sounded distant, dreamy, like she was talking in her sleep. I tested the edge of the hole with my boot. The walls were smooth, carved rather than dug, and they felt warm to the touch despite the cold air. This wasn't something that could be excavated by hand, not in the time Sarah's team had been missing. "I'm going to get rope," I called down. "I'm coming to get you." "No," Sarah's voice came back, suddenly sharp and urgent. "No, don't come down. Don't come down here, Maggie. Run. Run while you still can." Then I heard the other voice. Male, unfamiliar, speaking in an accent I'd never heard before. The words were English, but old-fashioned, like something from a history book. "The sisters join us willingly," the voice said. "The brothers answer the call. Soon we march again. Soon we rise." I backed away from the hole, my flashlight beam dancing crazily as my hands shook. That was not one of Sarah's team members. That was not anyone from this century. The drumming sound was getting louder, and now I could hear other things mixed in with it. The clink of metal on metal, the creak of leather, the soft whisper of feet moving through dead grass. Somewhere in the mist that surrounded the excavation site, an army was gathering. I ran. Behind me, Sarah's voice called out one more time, but now it sounded different. Pleased. Satisfied. "Thank you for coming, Maggie," she said. "We've been waiting for you." I didn't stop running until I reached my camp, and even then, I couldn't catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the radio controls, but I had to try to get word out. People needed to know what was happening up here. The radio crackled to life, and for a moment I thought I had a clear signal. Then, the voices started coming through the speaker. Dozens of them, all talking at once in that same old-fashioned accent I'd heard from the hole. "Company, attention. Form ranks. Fix bayonets. For the glory of the cause." I switched frequencies, but the voices followed me. Men calling orders, singing battle hymns, reciting what sounded like military roll call. The names they called were from another time. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Obadiah, good biblical names that parents gave their sons in the 1800s. Then I heard a new voice cut through the chaos, clear and commanding. "Ranger Ironwood," it said, "we know you're listening." I nearly dropped the radio. "Nobody should know my name, not out here," the voice continued. Patient and eerily calm. "You have found our sacred place. You have seen our great work. Now you must choose, join us willingly, or be taken by force." "Who is this?" I managed to say into the microphone. "What do you want?" "I am Captain Mordecai Blackwood, late of the Confederate States Army, and I have been waiting a very long time to complete my mission." Your friends understood. In the end, they saw the glory of what we're building here. The temperature around my camp began to drop. Not gradually, like evening coming on, but all at once, as if someone had opened a door to winter itself. My breath started coming out in puffs, and frost began forming on my equipment. The bones remember, Captain Blackwood's voice continued. They remember the pain of defeat, the shame of surrender. But death is not the end, Ranger Ironwood. Death is just another form of service. I switched off the radio and started breaking down my camp. Whatever was happening here was beyond my ability to handle alone. I needed backup, I needed equipment, and I needed to get off this mountain before dark. But as I stuffed my sleeping bag into its sack, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. They stood at the edge of the clearing like shadows given form. Soldiers in gray uniforms that were somehow both tattered and pristine. Their faces were pale as moonlight, their eyes dark as the hole I'd found in the bone church. Some carried muskets with bayonets fixed. Others held sabers that gleamed despite the overcast sky. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched me with the patience of the dead. I counted 12 of them, then 20, then stopped counting because more kept materializing from the mist. They formed a loose circle around my camp, close enough that I could see the details of their uniforms. Brass buttons with Confederate insignia, worn leather belts, boots that had walked through too many battles. The one in front stepped forward. He was tall and lean, with a carefully trimmed beard and the kind of bearing that spoke of command. A captain's bars gleamed on his collar. "Mordecai Blackwood," I whispered, and he smiled. "At your service, ma'am." Though I prefer my original rank, Major Blackwood, 14th Virginia Cavalry. I've had many long years to reflect on military strategy, you see. Many years to plan. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised that my voice sounded steady. "What any soldier wants," he replied. "To complete the mission, to serve the cause, to rise when called." He gestured toward the excavation site. "This place has power, Ranger Ironwood. Power that flows from sacrifice, from blood spilled in righteous battle. The bones of my men have been feeding that power for over a century." "Sarah's team," I said. "What did you do to them?" "I gave them purpose," Blackwood answered. "They came here seeking the past, and I showed them how the past can serve the future. Their bones have joined the foundation of our church. Their spirits have answered the call to arms." As if summoned by his words, 4 more figures stepped out of the mist. They wore modern clothes, hiking boots, fleece jackets, the kind of practical gear that archaeologists prefer. But their faces had the same pale, distant look as the Confederate soldiers. One of them was Sarah. "Hello, Maggie," she said, her voice that same dreamy tone I'd heard from the hole. "Isn't it wonderful? The past and present, united at last. No more separation between the living and the dead." I wanted to run, but the circle of soldiers had closed tighter. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt frozen. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for my knowledge of history. "You lost," I told Blackwood. "The war's been over for more than 100 years. The Confederacy fell, slavery ended. You have no cause to serve anymore." His smile never wavered. "Causes change, Ranger Ironwood. But the need for soldiers, that's eternal. There are always wars to fight, always enemies to defeat. The living have grown soft, forgotten the glory of sacrifice. We remember, and soon we will teach them." The bone church began to glow with a pale, sickly light. The arranged bones hummed with energy, and I could feel something vast and hungry stirring beneath the ground. Whatever power Blackwood had been feeding with death and sacrifice, it was almost ready to be unleashed. "Your choice, ma'am," he said, raising his saber. "Join us willingly, and your death will be quick. Resist, and you'll spend eternity wishing you had surrendered." That's when I heard the sound of a helicopter approaching through the mountain passes. The sound of rotor blades cut through the supernatural stillness like salvation itself. I looked up to see a Forest Service chopper cresting the ridge, probably responding to my missed check-ins. The pilot wouldn't be able to land on the boggy plateau, but at least someone would know where I was. But as I watched, something impossible happened. The helicopter's engine noise changed, deepened, became the rhythmic pounding of drums and marching feet. The aircraft itself flickered like a mirage, and for a moment I could swear I saw a cavalry unit riding across the sky, their battle flags streaming in an otherworldly wind. "Time bends here," Major Blackwood said conversationally. Past and present flow together like tributaries feeding a river. That flying machine is real, but so is the cavalry charge your mind insists on seeing. Both exist. Both are true. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over my radio, but it kept shifting between modern speech and Civil War-era commands. One moment, Ranger Ironwood, please respond, over. The next, forward the line, advance at the gallop. I realized then that Blackwood wasn't just raising the dead. He was warping reality itself, using the spiritual energy of this old battlefield to break down the barriers between what was and what is. The Bone Church wasn't just a monument. It was some kind of machine, powered by death and focused through ritual. A century of preparation, Blackwood continued, as if reading my thoughts. Every deer that died on this plateau, every bird that fell from the sky, every insect that crawled into the bog to die, all of it feeding the power we needed. The archaeologists were just the final components, the human sacrifice needed to activate our great work. Sarah stepped closer, her dead eyes reflecting the unholy light from the bone structure. It doesn't hurt, Maggie, she said. Death is just the beginning. We see so much more now. I backed toward the excavation site, partly because I was terrified, and partly because I was starting to form a desperate plan. If this power came from death and sacrifice, maybe it could be disrupted by giving the dead what they really wanted, peace. You talk about glory, I called to Blackwood, but you're just grave robbers, thieves who won't let these soldiers rest. His pale face darkened. These men died for honor. They deserve better than to rot forgotten in unmarked graves. They deserve proper burial, I shot back. They deserve to go home. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw uncertainty flicker across the faces of the Confederate ghosts. These had been real men once, with families and homes and dreams beyond war. Maybe some part of them remembered what they'd lost. The 14th West Virginia Infantry, I continued, pulling facts from my research. Jeremiah Cooper, age 19, from a farm near Clarksburg. Ezekiel Morris, 22, left behind a pregnant wife. Obadiah Franklin, the youngest at 17, lied about his age to enlist. Several of the soldiers looked confused, as if they were trying to remember something important. Blackwood snarled and raised his saber. Enough. You will not poison my men with sentiment. He lunged at me, the blade whistling through the air where my head had been a second before. I dove sideways, rolled, and came up running toward the Bone Church. If I could disrupt the arrangement somehow, maybe break whatever ritual was powering this madness. But as I reached the entrance, a hand grabbed my ankle. Sarah, moving with unnatural speed and strength, dragged me down into the mud. Her grip felt like ice, and where her fingers touched my skin, numbness spread up my leg. The living don't understand, she hissed. Death is so much better. So much clearer. I kicked free and scrambled toward the central hole, the one where I'd first heard Sarah's voice. The opening was wider now, and the pale light was stronger. Looking down into it was like staring into the heart of something fundamentally wrong with the world. But I could see the bottom now. Maybe 30 feet down, carved chambers extended in all directions, and in those chambers, dozens of figures moved in slow procession. Confederate soldiers, Union soldiers, and what looked like much older remains. Native Americans, perhaps, from before European settlement. All of them bound together in Blackwood's army of the dead. Magnificent, isn't it? Blackwood appeared beside the hole, his saber now pointed at my throat. Centuries of death, unified under one command. We will march again, Ranger Ironwood. We will show the living what true sacrifice means. I thought of everything I knew about Civil War history, about the terrible price these mountains had paid in blood and suffering. Then I thought about the one thing that might reach these lost souls. Attention, I shouted in my best drill sergeant voice, the tone I'd learned from my grandfather who'd served in World War II. Every ghost in the clearing snapped to attention, including Blackwood. Old habits died hard, even for the dead. By order of the United States government, I continued, this engagement is concluded. The war is over. All personnel are hereby ordered to report for discharge and return to your homes. For a moment, blessed silence fell over the plateau. The Confederate soldiers looked confused, uncertain. Even Sarah seemed to waver, as if some part of her remembered being human. But Blackwood recovered quickly. False orders, he roared. This woman has no authority here. He swung his saber at my head, and I threw myself backward. The blade missed, but my momentum carried me over the edge of the hole. I fell 30 feet into the heart of the bone church, landing hard on a floor made from interwoven ribs and finger bones. The chambers down here were worse than anything I'd seen above ground. Every surface was covered with human remains, but these bones moved. They writhed and shifted like living things, reaching out to grab at me as I struggled to my feet. And in the center of it all stood the source of the power. A figure that might once have been human, but had long since become something else. Its body was held together by Civil War-era military equipment. Brass buttons, leather straps, bits of uniform fabric. Its face was a skull wrapped in yellowed skin, and its eyes burned with the same pale fire that lit the bone church. "Welcome," it said in a voice like grinding tombstones. "I have been so very hungry." This was the real necromancer. Blackwood was just a servant. This thing had been feeding on death for generations, growing stronger with each sacrifice, building toward some terrible purpose. I ran. The bone chambers were a maze, but I had one advantage. I knew how to navigate by counting steps and memorizing turns. Even in my panic, my ranger training held. Left tunnel, 15 steps. Right branch, 30 steps. Narrow passage, duck low, 22 steps. Behind me, the necromancer gave chase, its bone servants clacking and scraping as they followed. I could hear Blackwood's voice echoing from above, calling orders to his ghost soldiers. They were sealing off the exits, making sure I couldn't escape. But I wasn't trying to escape. I was looking for the source. Every bit of supernatural power has an anchor in the physical world, something that channels and focuses the energy. For a necromancer this old, it would be something personal, something that connected it to its first taste of death. I found it in a chamber lined with the oldest bones I'd seen yet, Native American remains that predated any European settlement. In the center sat a wooden chest, rotted with age but still intact. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was a journal written in faded ink. The pages told the story of Ezra Whitmore, a spiritualist who'd come to these mountains in 1823. He'd been seeking to communicate with the dead, to prove that death was not the end. Instead, he'd found something that had been waiting in the bog for centuries, some ancient hunger that fed on the boundary between life and death. The journal's final entry was barely legible. "It has shown me such wonders. I will not age. I will not die. I need only feed it what it craves, and I will live forever to serve its purpose." Whitmore had become the necromancer, sustained by the power he fed with sacrifice. The Civil War had been a feast for him, so much death in one place, and now he was strong enough to expand beyond this mountain. I tore pages from the journal and used my lighter to set them ablaze. The effect was immediate. Screams echoed through the bone chambers, and I could feel the whole structure beginning to shake. The necromancer's power was tied to its origin story, and I was burning that connection. The creature itself appeared in the chamber doorway, no longer pretending to be human. It was a writhing mass of bones and rotted flesh, held together by centuries of malevolent will. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed. "I am eternal." "Nothing's eternal," I replied, setting fire to more pages. "Everything ends." The flames spread to the wooden chest, then to the oiled leather wrapping. The necromancer's scream became a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. Cracks appeared in the bone walls, and I could hear the sound of the structure collapsing above me. I ran again, this time toward the shaft of pale light that marked the central hole. The bone floor was falling apart beneath my feet, and chunks of the ceiling rained down as the necromancer's death throes brought down its cathedral. I reached the bottom of the shaft just as a pile of leg bones formed a makeshift ladder. Without thinking, I started climbing, driven by pure survival instinct. 20 feet up, 30, the sounds of destruction fading below me. I emerged from the hole to find the plateau quiet. The ghost soldiers were gone. The bone church was collapsing into itself, the carefully arranged remains finally allowed to rest. Even the sweet flower smell was fading, replaced by the clean scent of mountain air. But I wasn't alone. Sarah and her 3 team members stood near my abandoned camp, looking confused and frightened, but definitely alive. The necromancer's destruction had released them from whatever power had claimed them. "Maggie," Sarah said, her voice small and uncertain. "What happened?" "I remember starting the excavation, and then, nothing. How long have we been missing?" I helped them gather their scattered equipment while I tried to figure out how to explain what had happened. In the end, I settled for a version of the truth. Gas leak, I told them. Natural methane seepage from the bog. It can cause hallucinations, memory loss, disorientation. You've been wandering around confused for 5 days. It wasn't entirely a lie. The bog did produce methane, and people did sometimes have strange experiences in places where the barriers between worlds wore thin. Sarah's team accepted the explanation, grateful to be alive and eager to get off the mountain. We hiked out together that evening, and I filed my official report the next week. Archaeological excavation suspended due to hazardous gas emissions. Area closed to public access pending environmental assessment. That was 6 months ago. I still work the Dolly Sods wilderness, but I pay closer attention now to the old stories the local people tell. Stories about places where the dead don't rest easy. Stories about mountains that remember too much. The excavation site is officially off limits, but I check on it every few weeks. The ground has settled into a natural-looking depression, and grass is starting to grow over the disturbed earth. The bones are finally at rest. Mostly. Sometimes, when the mist is heavy and the wind is just right, I can still hear distant drums echoing across the plateau. On those days, I make sure to be somewhere else before nightfall. Because I learned something important in those bone chambers beneath Dolly Sods, some hungers are too old and too strong to ever completely die. They just wait for someone foolish enough to feed them again. And there are a lot of old battlefields in these mountains. A lot of places where people died violent deaths and were never properly laid to rest. The necromancer of Dolly Sods is gone, but the power it tapped into, that's still there, sleeping in the bog, waiting for the right combination of death and desperation to wake it up again. I've started keeping a list of sites to watch. Places where the temperature runs a few degrees warmer than it should. Places where animals avoid walking, where plants grow in strange patterns, where the local people still whisper about things that walk when they shouldn't. Because, if I learned anything from my encounter with Major Blackwood and his army of the dead, it's that the past is never really past in these mountains. It just waits, patient as stone, for its chance to rise again. And next time, I plan to be ready. My name is Robert Wildwood, but everyone calls me Bobby. I've been a ranger at Jefferson National Forest for 20 years now, and in all that time, I never believed in ghost stories or devil dogs or any of that nonsense the old-timers used to talk about around their fires. I should have listened. I worked the Mount Rogers area in Virginia, way up in the high country where the wild ponies roam and the air gets thin. It's beautiful country, don't get me wrong. Rolling meadows stretch between ancient mountains, and on clear days you can see for miles. But it's also lonely country. The nearest farm is 20 miles down winding mountain roads, and cell phone service is spotty at best. My job is predator management and livestock protection. Sounds fancy, but really it means I'm the guy farmers call when something's been killing their cattle. Could be bears, could be coyotes, could be wild dogs. I've seen it all in 2 decades of tracking through these mountains. I grew up on a farm myself, down in the valley before I took this job. My daddy taught me to read tracks like other folks read books. I can tell you how old a track is, what the animal was doing when it made it, and where it was probably headed. It's not magic, just patience and practice. The farmers around here, they're good people. Families that have been working this land for 5-6 generations. They know these mountains like the back of their hands, and they don't spook easy. When old Marcus Hillman called me in October of 1986, his voice was different. Scared maybe, though Marcus had never been scared of anything in his 63 years. "Bobby," he said over the crackling phone line, "I need you up here. Something's been at my cattle, and it ain't like anything I've seen before." I loaded my truck with the usual gear, plaster for making casts of tracks, camera, rifle, first aid kit. The drive to Marcus's place takes about an hour on good days, longer when the weather's bad. That particular morning was unseasonably warm for October, one of those strange days when the mountains can't decide if it's summer or winter. When I got to Marcus's farm, I could see the problem right away. 3 head of Angus cattle lay dead in his high pasture, and they hadn't died easy. I've seen bear kills and coyote kills, but this was different. The wounds were too clean, too precise. Whatever had done this, knew exactly what it was doing. Marcus met me at the fence line. He was a big man, hands like ham hocks from a lifetime of farm work. But his hands were shaking as he lit his cigarette. "Started 3 weeks ago," he said, not looking at me. "Lost 1 cow, then 2 more the next week. Now this." He gestured at the bodies in his field. "Whatever's doing it, it's getting bolder." I walked among the dead cattle, taking pictures and notes. The bite marks were massive, bigger than any dog breed I knew. But the strangest thing was how the bodies were arranged. They formed a rough circle, heads pointing inward like they were protecting something in the center. "Marcus," I said, "did you move these cattle at all?" He shook his head. "Found them just like that this morning. Damnedest thing I ever saw." That's when I noticed the tracks. They were in the soft mud near the water trough, clear as day. Dog prints, but enormous, the biggest I'd ever seen. I made casts and took measurements. 6 inches long, 4 inches wide. Whatever made these tracks would have stood waist-high to a man. "You see any strange dogs around lately?" I asked. "Maybe somebody's dog got loose?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Bobby, ain't no dog around here that big, and even if there was, how do you explain this?" He led me to his fence line. The barbed wire was torn apart, but not cut. It looked like it had been pulled apart by hand or paw. The metal was twisted and bent in ways that would take incredible strength. As we stood there looking at the damaged fence, the wild ponies that usually grazed in the area came trotting over the ridge. But instead of heading down toward the water like they always did, they stopped dead. Their ears were back, and they were snorting and stamping. Then, all at once, they turned and galloped away. "Been doing that for weeks now," Marcus said. "Won't come near this pasture anymore." Animals know things, Bobby. They can sense when something ain't right. I spent the rest of that day looking for more tracks, checking the surrounding area. The trail led up into the timber, toward the old Cherokee hunting grounds high on the mountain. But after about a mile, the tracks just stopped. Not like the animal had jumped to rocks or hard ground, they just ended, like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. Driving home that evening, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. In 20 years of this work, I'd never encountered anything like it. The size of the tracks, the strength needed to tear through that fence, the way the cattle were arranged, none of it fit any normal predator pattern. But I'm a practical man. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a bear, though the tracks were all wrong. Maybe it was wild dogs, though I'd never seen any that large. Maybe somebody was keeping an illegal exotic pet that had gotten loose. I set up trail cameras around Marcus's property and the surrounding area. If something was out there, I'd get pictures of it. Then we'd know what we were dealing with. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. The trail cameras malfunctioned. All of them. I checked them after 3 days, expecting to find photos of whatever had been killing the cattle. Instead, I found images that made no sense. Heat signatures that showed up as massive shapes, but when the regular camera fired a second later, there was nothing there. Just empty forest. Dr. Rachel Ridgway from Virginia Tech's Wildlife Biology Department came out to help with the investigation. She was young, maybe 30, with short, dark hair and the kind of confidence that comes from years of studying dangerous animals. Rachel had worked with wolf reintroduction programs in other states and knew more about large predator behavior than anyone else I could think of. "The tracks are definitely canine," she said, examining my plaster casts, "but the size is impossible. The largest wolf on record wouldn't make prints this big." We were sitting in my office at the ranger station, going over all the evidence I'd collected. Outside, an early winter storm was blowing through, bringing the first real cold snap of the season. "Could be a hybrid," I suggested. "Wolf-dog cross, maybe escaped from somewhere." Rachel shook her head. "Even then, the proportions are wrong. Look at the stride length compared to the paw size. This animal would have to be built like nothing I've ever seen." That's when my radio crackled to life. It was Marcus, and he was shouting, "Bobby, Bobby, you there? I need help up here right now." I grabbed the radio. "What's wrong, Marcus?" "They're here. The damn things are here, and they got 3 more of my cattle. I can see them from my kitchen window." Rachel and I looked at each other. "We're on our way," I said into the radio. "Whatever you do, don't go outside." The drive to Marcus's farm had never seemed so long. The storm was getting worse, and the wind was howling through the trees. By the time we got there, it was full dark, and snow was starting to fall. Marcus's house was lit up like Christmas, every light on. We could see him in the kitchen window, pacing back and forth with what looked like a hunting rifle in his hands. When we knocked on his door, he nearly jumped out of his skin. "Thank God you're here," he said, letting us in. They'd been out there for the past hour, just circling the pasture. "How many?" Rachel asked, already getting her equipment ready. 7, maybe 8, hard to tell in the dark. Marcus led us to the kitchen window. "They're bigger than I thought, much bigger." I looked out into the pasture, squinting through the falling snow. At first I didn't see anything. Then Rachel handed me her night vision binoculars, and my blood went cold. They were dogs, but unlike any dogs I'd ever seen, black as midnight and the size of small horses. Their eyes reflected the light from the house, glowing like red coals in the darkness. They moved around the pasture in perfect formation, like soldiers on patrol. "Jesus," I whispered. One of them looked directly at the house, directly at me. For a moment, I felt like it could see right through the night vision scope, right into my soul. Then it opened its mouth and let out a howl that made my bones ache. The others joined in, creating a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. Not just loud, but wrong somehow. Like voices from hell itself. "We need to call this in," Rachel said, but her voice was shaking. "Call who?" I asked. "And tell them what? That we've got demon dogs in the pasture?" The howling stopped suddenly, and the silence was somehow worse. I looked through the binoculars again, scanning the field. Empty. They were gone. "Where did they?" I started to say, then heard a scratching sound above us. All three of us looked up at the ceiling. Something was walking across Marcus's roof. Something heavy. The footsteps moved slowly from one end of the house to the other, then stopped directly over the kitchen. A few bits of dust drifted down from the ceiling. "How did they get up there?" Rachel whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from inside the house itself. The windows rattled in their frames. Then, silence. We waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I worked up the courage to go outside and check. The roof was covered with tracks in the fresh snow. The same impossibly large paw prints I'd been finding around the dead cattle. But there was something else, something that made my hands shake as I took pictures. Mixed in with the dog tracks were what looked like human footprints. Bare footprints in the snow, as if someone had been walking around up there without any shoes on. "That's impossible," Rachel said when I showed her the photos. "No human could survive barefoot in this weather." When we checked on the cattle the next morning, we found 3 more dead. But this time, they hadn't just been killed. They'd been drained of blood. Every last drop. The carcasses were pale and shrunken, like empty skins. And carved into the frozen ground around them, in letters 3 feet tall, was a single word: mine. Marcus Hillman was found dead 2 days later. The sheriff called me at dawn, his voice grim. "Bobby, you better get up to the Hillman place, and bring your camera." I knew before I got there what I'd find, but seeing it was different than imagining it. Marcus lay in his front yard, 20 feet from his kitchen door. He'd been partially eaten, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was his face, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His rifle lay beside him, unfired. "Coroner says he died of a heart attack," Sheriff Davis told me. "Scared to death, literally." I walked around the scene, taking pictures and looking for clues. The tracks were everywhere now, no longer confined to the pastures. They led right up to the house, circled it several times, then headed back toward the forest. "This isn't random," I told the sheriff. "They're hunting specific targets." "They?" I showed him the photographs from the night before, the images of the massive dogs in the pasture. His face went pale. "How many other farmers in this area?" he asked. 3 more with livestock in the high pastures," I said. "The Jensen place, the Coopers, and old Bill Travers up on White Top Mountain. Better warn them." But when I tried to call the other farmers, none of them answered their phones. The storm had knocked out most of the phone lines in the area, and the roads were getting too bad to drive. Rachel and I decided to check on them anyway. We took my 4-wheel drive truck and a portable radio, though I wasn't sure how much good either would do us. The Jensen farm was first. We found the house empty and 3 dead cattle in the field, arranged in that same circular pattern. No sign of the family. At the Cooper place, we found something worse. The farmhouse had been ransacked, furniture overturned, and windows broken. There was blood on the kitchen floor, but no bodies. "They took them," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. "Took them where?" She pointed to tracks leading from the house toward the deep woods. Human footprints and dog prints, side by side, like they were walking together. That's when I realized what we were really dealing with. These weren't just animals killing livestock. They were something else entirely. Something that could think and plan and hunt humans like prey. The radio in my truck crackled to life. It was Bill Travers, and he was screaming, "Anybody out there? Anybody? They got me surrounded up here. They're trying to get in the house." I grabbed the radio. "Bill, this is Bobby Wildwood. Where are you exactly?" "Up on Whitetop, in the old cabin near Devil's Den. They've been howling outside for hours, and now they're scratching at the walls." "Hang tight, Bill. We're coming." But even as I said it, I knew we might be too late. Whitetop Mountain was an hour's drive in good weather, and the storm was getting worse. We made it about halfway before we had to stop. A tree had fallen across the mountain road, and there was no way around it. Rachel and I would have to go the rest of the way on foot. "Maybe we should go back and get help," she suggested. "No time," I said. "Besides, who would believe us?" We loaded our packs with emergency gear and started up the mountain trail. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind cut through our clothes like knives. But we kept going, following the old Cherokee trail that hunters had used for hundreds of years. That's when I started to understand the real truth about these mountains. The Cherokee hadn't just hunted here. They'd hidden things. Sacred things. Dangerous things. Things that were meant to stay buried. We found evidence of it as we climbed. Stone markers carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Old burial mounds covered with trees. And everywhere, that feeling of being watched. "Bobby," Rachel said, stopping suddenly. "Listen." I stopped and held my breath. In the distance, carried on the wind, I could hear howling. But it wasn't coming from ahead of us, where Bill's cabin was. It was coming from behind us, from the direction we'd just come. "They're hurting us," I realized. "Driving us toward something." That's when we saw the lights. Not electric lights, but fires. Dozens of them, scattered through the forest ahead of us. They flickered and danced like torches, but there was no one holding them. "What is this place?" Rachel whispered. I pulled out my map and tried to figure out where we were. According to the topographical survey, we were standing in an area called Devil's Den, a depression in the mountainside where local legends said the Cherokee had once fought a great battle against evil spirits. The same place where Bill had said he was trapped. As we got closer to the fires, I could see they weren't natural flames at all. They were cold, blue-white lights that gave off no heat. And standing around them, like sentries on guard duty, were the dogs. 7 of them, just like Marcus had said. Bigger than any wolf, with eyes that glowed like hot coals. They were waiting for us. But the strangest thing was what lay in the center of their circle. Wooden boxes, old and rotted, with metal bands around them. Treasure chests, like something out of a pirate movie. "Civil War gold," I whispered, remembering the stories my grandfather used to tell. Confederate treasure hidden in these mountains when the war ended. One of the dogs raised its head and looked directly at me. When it opened its mouth, words came out. Human words, in a voice like grinding stone. "You will not take what is ours." That's when I knew we weren't dealing with animals at all. We were dealing with guardians. Supernatural protectors of something that had been hidden in these mountains for over 100 years. And they would kill anyone who tried to find it. The lead dog stepped forward, and I could see it clearly for the first time. It was massive, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with fur so black it seemed to absorb light. But its eyes were the worst part, intelligent, ancient, and filled with purpose. "The treasure must remain hidden," it said in that grinding stone voice, "as it has for 123 years. "We're not here for gold," I said, surprised that my voice worked at all. "We're looking for Bill Travers. A man who's lost up here." The creature tilted its massive head. "The old one? He has seen what should not be seen. He knows what should not be known. Where is he?" Instead of answering, the dog gestured with its snout toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. That's when I saw the cabin, a tiny hunting shack built into the mountainside, almost invisible in the swirling snow. And standing in front of it, perfectly still, was Bill Travers. "Bill!" Rachel called out, starting toward him. "No." I grabbed her arm. Something was wrong with the way Bill was standing. Too straight, too motionless. Like a statue. The lead dog's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, showing teeth like railroad spikes. He chose to stay, to become guardian, like us. That's when Bill turned around, and I saw his eyes. They glowed with the same red light as the dog's. His face was pale as death, but he was still breathing, still alive, but changed. "Hello, Bobby," he said in a voice that was his, but also wasn't. "I've been waiting for you." "What did you do to him?" Rachel demanded. "We offered him a choice," the lead dog said. "Serve as guardian of the treasure or die defending it." He chose service. "I chose survival," Bill corrected, walking toward us with movements too fluid, too controlled. "These mountains hold secrets, Bobby. Gold from the Confederate treasury, hidden here when Richmond fell. But the gold is cursed. Anyone who takes it brings ruin to the land." He gestured to the treasure chests behind the ring of dogs. So the Cherokee made a pact with spirits of the earth. Guardians would protect the gold, and the curse would stay buried. The dogs are those spirits, given form. "That's impossible," Rachel said, but her voice was shaking. Bill laughed, and the sound was like wind through dead leaves. "Is it? You've seen them. You know what they can do." The storm was getting worse, and I realized we were running out of time. If we didn't get off this mountain soon, we'd freeze to death up here. But the dogs weren't going to let us leave. Not now that we knew their secret. "What do you want from us?" I asked. The lead dog stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from its body. "The same choice we offered him. Join us or die. And if we join you, you become guardians. You help protect what must remain hidden. You live forever, serving the mountain." I looked at Rachel, saw the fear in her eyes. But I also saw something else. Determination. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. "There's a third option," I said, pulling my rifle from my shoulder. The lead dog's eyes flared brighter. "Iron cannot harm us. We are not flesh." "Maybe not," I said, aiming at one of the treasure chests instead of the dog. "But I bet you don't want this gold scattered across the mountainside." All 7 dogs growled at once, the sound like an earthquake. The blue flames around the treasure chests flared higher. "You would not dare. Try me." For a long moment, we stared at each other. The storm howled around us, and the supernatural fires cast dancing shadows on the snow. I could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on this place, the accumulated power of whatever pact the Cherokee had made. Then Bill spoke up. "There's another way, Bobby. The gold doesn't have to stay here forever. It just has to be properly reburied. Somewhere sacred, somewhere the curse can sleep." "Silence," the lead dog snarled, but I could see uncertainty in its glowing eyes. "The Cherokee burial ground," Bill continued, ignoring the dog. "Down in the valley. If the treasure is taken there and buried with the proper rituals, the guardians can rest. The curse will be broken." "Is that true?" I asked the lead dog. It was quiet for so long I thought it wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, it nodded. "If the white man's gold returns to the earth where our ancestors sleep, we can find peace. But it must be done willingly by those who have seen our truth." I looked at Rachel again. She gave me a small nod. "All right," I said, lowering my rifle. "We'll help you move the treasure. But Bill comes with us. And no more killing." The lead dog considered this. "Agreed, but know this. If you betray us, if you try to take even a single coin, we will hunt you forever." It took us 3 trips to move all the treasure chests down to the Cherokee burial ground in the valley. Bill helped, though he was different now. Stronger than a man his age should be, and his eyes still held that red glow in the dark. The burial ground was on my ranger station's property, a small grove of ancient oaks that had been protected by federal law for decades. The Cherokee had used it for over 1,000 years before European settlers arrived. We dug through the night, taking turns with shovels while the demon dogs watched from the edge of the trees. The hole had to be deep, 12 feet down, to ensure the treasure would stay buried. When we lowered the last chest into the ground, something changed. The air itself felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had been lifted. The dogs stepped forward, and I could see they were fading, becoming translucent. "It is finished," the lead dog said, its voice already growing distant. "The pact is fulfilled." One by one, they dissolved into mist and shadow, until only their glowing eyes remained. Then even those winked out, and they were gone. Bill collapsed to his knees in the snow, gasping. When he looked up at us, his eyes were normal again, tired and confused. But human. What happened? He asked. Last thing I remember, I was in my cabin, and those things were scratching at the door. Rachel and I helped him to his feet. It's over, I told him. You're safe now. We filled in the grave and marked it with a simple stone cairn. To anyone who might find it later, it would just look like an old Cherokee burial site. Which, in a way, it was. The official report I filed with the Forest Service blamed the livestock deaths on a pack of hybrid wolf dogs that had since moved on to other territory. The farmers' insurance covered their losses, and life in the mountains slowly returned to normal. But things were different for me. I knew now that there were forces in these mountains, older and more powerful than anything I'd learned in ranger school. The Cherokee hadn't just been superstitious about certain areas. They'd been protecting secrets that could destroy lives. I kept working as a ranger, but I made sure to learn more about the local history and folklore. I studied the old stories, the sacred sites, the places where legend said the spirits still walked. Because if there was one cache of cursed treasure hidden in these mountains, there might be others. And if there were other guardians, other supernatural protectors of ancient secrets, I wanted to be ready. 3 months after that night at Devil's Den, I got a call from a farmer down in Tennessee. He was losing cattle to something that killed like a pack of wolves, but left tracks bigger than any wolf ever made. I packed my gear and headed south, wondering what other secrets were buried in the Appalachian Mountains, and what other guardians were waiting in the darkness, protecting treasures that should never see the light of day. The work of a forest ranger is never really done, especially when your job includes keeping the peace between the living world and the dead. My name is Robert Wildwood, and I've seen things in Jefferson National Forest that would make most people quit their jobs and move to the city. But these mountains are my home, and someone has to stand watch over the secrets they keep, even if those secrets have teeth. My name is Patricia Moonbeam, but everyone calls me Patty. I've been a park ranger for 17 years now, working the high country of West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest. Most folks think ranger work is all campfire safety talks and bear warnings, but I've got a PhD in botany and spend most of my time studying the strange plants that grow up in our mountain bogs. Never believed in witch lights until they started following me home. The Cranberry Wilderness sits at over 3,000 feet above sea level, where the air stays thin and cold even in summer. It's a place that feels older than the mountains themselves. Endless bogs filled with plants that shouldn't exist this far south. Carnivorous sundews, rare orchids, and sphagnum moss that can hold 20 times its weight in water. I've cataloged over 200 species up there that most botanists only read about in textbooks. My specialty is medicinal plants. Spent 3 years in the Peace Corps in Guatemala, learning how indigenous people used local flora for healing. When I came back to West Virginia, I found the Cherokee had similar traditions in these mountains. The old-timers still remember stories about plant gatherers who could make the sick well and the well sick, depending on their mood. June of 1984 started normal enough. I was leading a research project documenting unusual plant mutations we'd been seeing in the Cranberry Glades bog system. My partner, Dr. Samuel Creekmore from the university, had been tracking electromagnetic anomalies in the same area. Sam's an old friend. We went through graduate school together, and he's one of the few people who takes my work seriously. The first sign something was wrong came from my field notes. I'd been mapping plant populations in grid squares, using GPS coordinates to track changes over time. Standard procedure: mark your quadrats, photograph everything, take soil samples, measure growth patterns. But when I compared my June readings to the previous month, nothing made sense. Plants were growing in perfect geometric patterns, not just randomly scattered like nature intended, but in precise circles, spirals, and straight lines. Trilliums forming perfect triangles, wild ginger arranged in concentric rings. Most disturbing were the jack and the pulpits. Normally they grow wherever water collects and soil stays moist, but I found 17 of them planted in a straight line running exactly north to south for half a mile. Sam arrived on June 15th with a truck full of electromagnetic monitoring equipment. We set up base camp near the main bog boardwalk, where tourists usually come to see the carnivorous plants. But the area felt different that summer. Quieter. Even the birds seemed nervous, staying away from certain sections of the marsh. "Look at this," Sam said, checking his EMF reader for the third time that morning. "I'm getting readings that shouldn't be possible. The electromagnetic field here is stronger than anything I've measured outside of a laboratory." I was busy photographing a patch of sundews that had somehow grown overnight into a perfect spiral pattern. Each tiny plant was exactly 6 inches from its neighbors, their sticky leaves all pointing toward the center. "How strong?" I asked, not looking up from my camera. "Strong enough to interfere with radio signals 15 miles away. The locals have been complaining about TV reception problems for weeks." That got my attention. I'd lived in these mountains long enough to know that when the old-timers start talking about their television sets acting up, something unusual is happening. Mountain folk don't complain about technology, they expect it to fail. "You think it's connected to the plant formations?" Sam shrugged, but I could see worry lines creasing his forehead. "I think we need to document everything carefully and try to find a scientific explanation." We spent the rest of that day taking measurements, photographing anomalies, and collecting soil samples. The bog stretched out around us like a green carpet, broken only by patches of dark water and the occasional stunted spruce tree. Mist hung low over everything, making it hard to see more than 50 feet in any direction. By evening, we'd covered maybe a quarter of the area we needed to survey. Sam's equipment showed electromagnetic spikes happening in regular patterns every 47 minutes. The readings would jump to impossible levels, then drop back to normal. "It's like something is turning on and off," he said, staring at his data sheets. "But I can't figure out what." We made camp that night on higher ground, away from the boggy areas. Standard wilderness protocol: hang your food, check for widowmakers overhead, keep your fire small. But as the sun went down, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The plants were glowing, not bright, just a faint green phosphorescence that you could only see in complete darkness. The same plants I'd been documenting all day, the ones growing in impossible patterns, were giving off their own light. "Sam," I whispered, shaking his sleeping bag. "You need to see this." He sat up, instantly alert. Rangers learn to wake up fast. "What is it?" I pointed toward the bog. In the darkness, we could see dozens of soft green lights scattered across the marsh, pulsing slowly like distant fireflies. But fireflies move randomly, chaotically. These lights were pulsing in unison, like they were all connected to the same electrical circuit. "Jesus Christ," Sam breathed. "How is that possible?" That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a botanical phenomenon anymore. We were dealing with something that wanted to be found. The next morning, everything looked normal again. No glowing plants, no impossible geometric patterns, just a typical Appalachian bog, misty and quiet in the early dawn. If not for Sam's electromagnetic readings and my photographs, I might have convinced myself we'd imagined the whole thing. "The patterns are still here," I said, walking between the perfectly arranged jack and the pulpits. "Whatever made these didn't go away when the sun came up." Sam was checking his equipment, making sure the electromagnetic spikes from the night before had been properly recorded. "Patty, I need to tell you something. I've been measuring EMF fluctuations in this area for 3 months. They started small, but they're getting stronger. Why didn't you mention this yesterday?" "Because I wanted to see if you'd noticed the same things I did." He looked up from his instruments, and I could see fear in his eyes. The electromagnetic activity corresponds exactly with the plant formations. Every time we get a spike, new growth appears in geometric patterns. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. In 17 years of botanical research, I'd never encountered anything that could make plants grow on command. "That's not possible, Sam. Plants don't respond to electromagnetic fields that way." "These do." We spent the morning expanding our survey area, moving deeper into the bog system. The further we went from the main boardwalk, the stranger things became. We found carnivorous plants growing in perfect squares, wild orchids arranged in spirals, and patches of moss that had somehow grown overnight to spell out what looked like letters in some ancient alphabet. "Look at this," I called to Sam from about 50 yards away. I was standing next to a cluster of pitcher plants that had grown into the shape of a 5-pointed star. Each plant was exactly the same size, and their hollow chambers all pointed toward the center. That's when we heard the scream. It came from somewhere behind us, back toward our base camp. a woman's voice, high and terrified, echoing across the bog. Sam and I looked at each other for one frozen moment, then started running. We found Jennifer Walsh, a graduate student from the university, standing knee-deep in murky bog water about 100 yards from our tents. She was staring straight ahead, not moving, not responding to our calls. Her pupils were dilated so wide that her eyes looked completely black. "Jenny," Sam splashed into the water, trying to reach her. "What happened? Can you hear me?" She didn't answer, didn't even blink, just stood there like a statue, staring at something we couldn't see. I grabbed her arm and pulled. Her skin felt ice cold, even though the morning was warm. "Help me get her out of the water," I told Sam. It took both of us to lift her. Jenny was a small woman, maybe 120 pounds, but her body had gone completely rigid. We carried her to dry ground and wrapped her in sleeping bags, but she never stopped staring at that spot in the bog. "Jenny, what did you see?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "What's out there?" For the first time since we'd found her, she moved. Her head turned slowly toward me, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "The lights," she whispered. "They're beautiful. They want me to come back." Sam was already on his radio, calling for emergency medical evacuation. But the radio just crackled with static. No matter what frequency he tried, he couldn't reach anyone. "The electromagnetic interference is too strong," he said. "We'll have to carry her out ourselves." That's when I noticed the plants around us were moving. Not growing, moving. The jack in the pulpits were turning their hooded flowers toward Jenny like they were watching her. The sundews were extending their sticky leaves in her direction. Even the sphagnum moss seemed to be creeping closer to where she lay. "Sam," I said quietly, "we need to leave. Right now." But Jenny suddenly sat up, her black eyes fixed on something behind us. "They're coming," she said. "The lights are coming back." I turned around and felt my blood freeze. Across the bog, maybe 200 yards away, green lights were beginning to appear. Not the soft phosphorescence we'd seen the night before. These were bright, pulsing orbs floating about 6 feet off the ground. And they were moving toward us. "Run," I said. "Grab what you can carry and run." We got maybe 50 yards before the lights caught up with us. They didn't make any sound, just drifted overhead like glowing balloons. But wherever they passed, the plants below began growing at impossible speed. I watched a patch of moss spread across 10 feet of ground in seconds. Ferns unfolded like time-lapse photography. New flowers bloomed and died and bloomed again. One of the lights descended until it was hovering right above Jenny's head. She looked up at it and smiled, the first normal expression we'd seen from her since finding her in the bog. "It's so pretty," she said. Then she started walking back toward the water. Sam tried to stop her, but the moment he got within 10 feet of the light, his knees buckled. I watched him collapse, his EMF reader sparking and smoking in his hand. "The electromagnetic field," he gasped. "It's scrambling my nervous system." I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the light. Whatever these things were, they were putting out enough electromagnetic energy to interfere with human biology. But Jenny walked right underneath it without any problem, like she was immune to its effects. The bog wants her back, I realized. That's why she can get close to it. The lights followed Jenny as she waded into the murky water. One by one, they began descending toward the surface, disappearing beneath the dark liquid like they were going home. Jenny walked deeper and deeper, until the water reached her chest, her neck, her chin. Then she was gone. Sam and I stood on the shore, waiting for her to surface. But the bog had turned perfectly still, dark as coffee, reflecting nothing. The lights were gone. The rapidly growing plants had stopped moving. Even the electromagnetic readings on Sam's damaged equipment had dropped to zero. "We have to call this in," Sam said. "Jenny just drowned, and we couldn't stop it." But I was staring at the water where she'd disappeared. No bubbles, no ripples, no sign that anyone had ever been there. "I don't think she drowned," I said quietly. "I think something took her." The search and rescue team arrived 6 hours later, after we'd hiked 15 miles to the nearest ranger station with working radio equipment. By the time we got back to the bog with professional divers and recovery equipment, the sun was setting. They found no trace of Jenny Walsh. No body, no clothing, no sign she'd ever been in the water. The dive team said the bog was only 8 feet deep where we'd seen her disappear, with a soft bottom that should have preserved footprints for days. But the mud showed nothing. "Are you sure this is where it happened?" asked Tom Brennan, the lead search coordinator. He'd known me for 10 years, and I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. "I'm sure," I said. "Jenny walked into the water right there, and she never came back out. But there's no evidence, Patty. No disturbance in the sediment, no personal items, nothing." Sam backed me up, showing Tom the electromagnetic readings from that morning. But the data made no sense to anyone without a background in physics, and Tom was starting to look at both of us like we'd suffered some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The official search continued for 3 days. Divers checked every inch of water. Ground teams walked grid patterns through the surrounding forest. A helicopter with thermal imaging flew search patterns over 50 square miles. Jenny Walsh had simply vanished. On the 4th day, they found her backpack. It was sitting on the bog boardwalk, exactly where visitors usually start their nature walks, completely dry, despite 3 days of rain. Inside were her field notes, her camera, and a thermos still warm with coffee. Like she'd just set it down and walked away. But the photographs on her camera told a different story. "Look at these," Sam said, scrolling through Jenny's digital images. We were in my ranger station, going through her equipment while the search teams packed up outside. The first dozen photos showed normal botanical documentation, close-ups of carnivorous plants, wide shots of the bog ecosystem, standard research imagery. But then the pictures began changing. Photo by photo, the plants in Jenny's images were rearranging themselves. The same patch of sundews, photographed over several hours, showed the tiny plants literally moving into geometric formations. In one image, they were scattered randomly. In the next, they formed a rough circle. By the final photo, they had created a perfect spiral pattern with mathematical precision. "This is impossible," I said. "Plants don't move like this. Not in hours, not in days. Some of these species can take weeks to show any growth at all." But the timestamp on the photos didn't lie. Jenny had documented the formation of the geometric patterns in real time over the course of a single afternoon. And in the background of her final shots, you could see the faint outline of green lights beginning to appear. Her last photograph showed something that made my hands shake. It was a close-up of the bog water where we'd lost her. But instead of the dark, murky surface we remembered, the image showed clear water with something glowing far beneath. Shapes that might have been plants, or might have been something else entirely. And in the very center of the frame, a pale human figure with arms outstretched, floating peacefully in the underwater glow. Jenny had photographed her own drowning from above, then somehow placed her camera back in her backpack on the boardwalk. "We need to leave this place," Sam said quietly. "Whatever's happening here, it's beyond anything we can study or understand." But I couldn't let it go. In 17 years as a ranger, I'd never walked away from a case without answers. People didn't just disappear in my wilderness, and they certainly didn't take pictures of their own deaths. That night, I went back to the bog alone. I parked my truck at the main trailhead and hiked the 2 miles to the boardwalk by moonlight. Standard wilderness protocol said never to work alone, especially after dark. But I needed to see the place without search teams and helicopters disrupting whatever was happening there. The bog was different at night, alive in ways I'd never noticed during daylight hours. The water moved with tiny currents that followed no pattern I could identify. Plants rustled without any wind, and every few minutes I could hear sounds like whispers coming from deep beneath the surface. I set up my equipment on the same spot where we'd lost Jenny. pH testing kit, soil thermometer, EMF reader borrowed from Sam's collection. If something was manipulating the local environment, I wanted to document exactly how it was happening. The electromagnetic readings started climbing immediately. Whatever was generating the field was stronger at night, building toward some kind of peak activity. I watched the needle climb past normal ranges, past anything I'd seen in my atmospheric science training, into levels that should have been disrupting electrical activity for miles. That's when the lights came back. They rose from the water like glowing bubbles, dozens of them, each one about the size of a basketball. Soft green phosphorescence that didn't hurt to look at directly, but seemed to pull at something deep in your mind. I found myself wanting to get closer, to understand what they were made of. The lights began moving in formation, creating patterns in the air above the bog. Spirals, figure eights, complex geometric shapes that reminded me of the plant arrangements we'd been finding. They were trying to communicate something, I realized, showing me the same mathematical relationships that had been appearing in the flora. I started taking pictures, documenting everything. But when I checked the camera's display screen, the images showed something completely different from what I was seeing with my eyes. Instead of floating lights, my photographs showed people. Dozens of human figures standing in the bog water, all of them glowing with the same green phosphorescence. Men and women in clothing from different time periods, some in modern hiking gear, others in old-fashioned dresses and work clothes, a few in what looked like traditional Cherokee garments. All of them standing peacefully in water that should have been over their heads, all of them staring directly at my camera. And in the front row, clear as daylight, was Jenny Walsh. She was smiling and waving, like she was posing for a family photograph. Behind her, I could see other faces I recognized from missing persons reports over the years. Hikers who'd disappeared in the cranberry wilderness, researchers who'd gone missing during botanical surveys, local people who'd vanished while gathering medicinal plants. They were all there, standing together in some underwater community that existed parallel to our world. I lowered my camera and looked at the bog with my naked eyes, just lights floating in formation above dark water. But the moment I raised the camera again, the underwater people reappeared, waving and smiling like they were welcoming me to join them. That's when I heard footsteps on the boardwalk behind me. I turned around, expecting to see Sam or one of the search team members. Instead, I found myself facing an old woman I'd never seen before. She was small and bent with age, wearing a long dress that seemed to be woven from moss and plant fibers. Her hair was white as bog cotton, and her eyes reflected the green light from the water like an animal's. "You've been studying my garden," she said. Her voice sounded like wind through pine needles. "Your garden? 300 years I've been tending this place. Gathering the lost ones, helping the plants grow in proper patterns. It's powerful medicine, if you understand how to use it." I backed away slowly, keeping my camera raised. Through the viewfinder, I could see that the old woman wasn't entirely human anymore. Plant fibers grew through her hair, moss covered sections of her skin. Her feet were rooted directly into the wooden boardwalk. "You're the one taking people," I said. "Taking?" She laughed, a sound like water bubbling up from underground springs. "Child, I'm offering them something better than the world above. Eternal life, in perfect harmony with the growing things. No sickness, no aging, no death. Just peace in the deep places." "What about their families, the people who love them?" "Love?" The bog witch, because that's what she was, I realized, tilted her head like she'd never heard the word before. "What is human love compared to the love of the earth itself? My children are happy here. They want for nothing." I looked at my camera display again. The underwater people were still waving, but their expressions seemed different now. Less like celebration and more like pleading. Jenny's smile looked frozen, desperate. Behind her, other faces showed eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. "They want to come home," I said. The old woman's expression darkened. Plants around us began growing visibly, reaching toward me with grasping tendrils. "You understand nothing about the gifts I offer, but you will learn." The electromagnetic field spiked so hard that my camera sparked and died. The bog lights brightened until they were painful to look at, and from somewhere beneath the water, I heard voices calling my name. I ran. I made it back to my truck and spent the rest of the night researching everything I could find about the cranberry wilderness. Historical records, Cherokee oral traditions, geological surveys, missing persons reports dating back to the early 1800s. By dawn, I had a clearer picture of what we were dealing with. The bog witch wasn't lying about her age. Local Cherokee stories mentioned a powerful medicine woman who had lived in the high mountain wetlands for centuries, sustained by spiritual communion with the plant spirits. She was known as a healer who could cure any illness, but also as someone who demanded payment for her services. The stories said she collected people who ventured too deep into her territory, keeping them as eternal servants in her underwater realm. More importantly, I found the key to stopping her. According to the traditional accounts, the bog witch's power came from her connection to 7 sacred plants that grew only in the cranberry glades. Each plant anchored her spirit to the physical world, and she used their combined energy to manipulate the entire ecosystem. But if someone could identify and destroy all 7 anchor plants, her hold on the bog would be broken. The Cherokee had tried this once, in 1842, when too many of their medicine gatherers had disappeared. They'd sent a team of 7 warriors to find and destroy the anchor plants. Only one man came back, and he spent the rest of his life warning people to stay away from the high bogs during new moon periods. But he'd also left detailed descriptions of what the anchor plants looked like and where to find them. I loaded my truck with everything I could think of that might help: pruning shears, a small hatchet, plant identification guides, Sam's electromagnetic equipment, and a handheld GPS unit. If I was going to break the Bog Witch's power, I needed to do it before she could add me to her collection. Sam met me at the trailhead just after sunrise. "You look like hell," he said, taking in my disheveled appearance and the wild look in my eyes. "I know what's taking people," I told him, "and I know how to stop it." I explained everything I'd learned about the Bog Witch and the 7 anchor plants. Sam listened without interrupting, occasionally checking his electromagnetic readings as we hiked toward the bog. "The EMF levels are off the charts," he said. "Whatever you saw last night, it's made the whole area more active. She knows we're coming back. She's getting ready for us." The first anchor plant was easy to find. According to the Cherokee descriptions, it would be a pitcher plant growing alone, larger than any normal specimen, with 7 distinct chambers instead of the usual 1 or 2. We found it exactly where the historical accounts said it would be, on a small island of solid ground, in the middle of the bog's deepest section. The plant was beautiful and terrible, nearly 4 feet tall, with chambers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. As I approached with my pruning shears, the chambers opened and closed like hungry mouths, and I could hear what sounded like whispers coming from deep inside them. "Are you sure about this?" Sam asked. I cut through the stem with one clean slice. The plant let out a sound like screaming wind, and every light in the bog pulsed once, very brightly, then dimmed. The electromagnetic readings on Sam's equipment dropped noticeably. "1 down," I said. 6 to go. The second plant was a sundew formation. Hundreds of tiny carnivorous plants growing in a perfect spiral, their sticky leaves all pointing toward a central cluster that was easily 10 times larger than any sundew had a right to be. When I started cutting through the anchor plant at the center, the smaller ones began writhing like they were in pain. By the time I destroyed the third anchor plant, a wild ginger specimen with roots that descended impossibly deep into the bog, the witch was starting to fight back. The water began rising, slowly but steadily, making it harder to reach the remaining plants. Electromagnetic pulses strong enough to make our teeth ache rolled across the bog every few minutes. And the missing people began appearing. Not the peaceful underwater community I'd seen in my photographs, but desperate souls trying to warn us away. Jenny Walsh materialized near the 4th anchor plant, her form translucent and flickering. "Patty, get out of here," she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from a great distance. "She's going to kill you both." "I'm trying to free you," I told her, cutting through another impossible plant formation. "You can't free us. We're part of her now, part of the bog. If you destroy her power, we'll die for real." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" "She doesn't just take people, Patty. She transforms them. We're not prisoners anymore. We're extensions of her will. Cut us off from the bog's energy, and we'll cease to exist." I looked at Sam, who was staring at Jenny's flickering form with horror. "There has to be another way," he said, but Jenny was already fading. "Find the 7th plant," she whispered. "The heart of her power. Maybe if you can control it instead of destroying it." She vanished, leaving us alone with the rising water and the growing electromagnetic interference. The 5th and 6th anchor plants were harder to find and harder to destroy. Each one we cut seemed to make the Bog Witch stronger, more desperate. The water was now knee-deep where it had been dry ground that morning. Strange lights moved beneath the surface, and we could hear voices calling to us from the depths. But I finally found the 7th plant, the one Jenny had called the heart of the witch's power. It was ancient beyond description, a massive oak tree that somehow grew directly out of the bog water, its roots spreading for hundreds of feet in all directions. But it wasn't just a tree. Looking closer, I could see that its trunk was partially human, with a woman's face embedded in the bark and arms that had become branches reaching toward the sky. The Bog Witch herself, transformed over centuries into something between plant and person, drawing power from the electromagnetic fields that ran deep beneath the mountains. "You came back," she said, her voice rustling through leaves that grew from her hair. "I wondered if you would have the courage." "I want you to let them go," I said, raising my hatchet. They are already gone, child. The people you knew are just memories now. But their essence lives on in my garden, part of something greater than any individual human life. That's not your choice to make. The bog witch smiled, showing teeth made of white birch bark. Everything grows, everything changes, everything dies and becomes something new. I simply guide the process, help lost souls find their proper place in the endless cycle. I swung the hatchet at her trunk. The blade bit deep, and she screamed with the voice of every person she'd ever taken. The bog erupted around us, water shooting up like geysers, plants growing and dying in seconds, electromagnetic energy crackling through the air like lightning. But instead of cutting all the way through, I stopped. Jenny's words echoed in my head. Maybe if you can control it instead of destroying it. What do you want? I asked the witch. Preservation, she said, her voice weaker now. The old knowledge is dying. The plants that could heal any illness, the traditions that kept humans in harmony with the natural world. I gathered people to preserve what would otherwise be lost, by stealing their lives, by offering them immortality. But perhaps, she paused, considering, perhaps there is another way. I lowered the hatchet. What kind of way? Become my successor, learn the true secrets of botanical medicine. Help me guide the bog without taking unwilling souls. The power needs a human anchor, someone who understands both worlds. Sam grabbed my arm. Patty, no, don't trust her. But I was thinking about Jenny's words. About all the missing people trapped in the bog's supernatural ecosystem. If I agree, will you release the others? Those who wish to return to the mortal world may go, the bog witch said. Those who choose to remain will do so freely, with full knowledge of what they're accepting. And the bog itself will continue to exist as a place of power and healing. But it will no longer be a trap. I looked at Sam, who was shaking his head frantically. Then I looked at the hatchet in my hands, knowing that one more swing would destroy the bog witch forever, along with everyone she'd taken over the centuries. I accept, I said. The transformation happened gradually over several weeks. The bog witch, who told me her original name had been Mary Howling Wolf, taught me how to commune with the plant spirits, how to channel the bog's electromagnetic energy, and how to distinguish between those who came seeking healing and those who simply wandered into dangerous territory by accident. Sam helped with the transition, using his equipment to monitor the electromagnetic changes as I learned to control them. The readings stabilized at levels that were unusual but not dangerous, and the plant formations shifted from rigid geometric patterns to more natural arrangements that still carried powerful healing properties. Jenny Walsh and 3 other missing persons chose to return to the physical world. The bog's energy had changed them. They aged more slowly, understood plants in ways that seemed almost telepathic, and could survive injuries that would kill normal humans. But they were fundamentally themselves again, with memories of their time in the underwater realm. 5 others, including 2 Cherokee medicine gatherers from the 1800s, chose to remain as guardians of the bog's deeper mysteries. They appeared occasionally to help with particularly difficult healing cases, but lived most of their existence in the liminal space between the physical and spiritual worlds. Mary Howling Wolf faded peacefully once she was certain the bog would be properly tended. Her centuries-old body became part of the great oak tree, but her consciousness merged with the bog's collective memory, available for consultation when I encountered problems beyond my understanding. The official story was that we'd discovered a previously unknown species of bioluminescent fungi that explained the witch lights phenomenon. The missing persons cases were closed as successful rescues, with medical amnesia explaining any gaps in their memories. My request to have the area designated as a special botanical research preserve was approved without question. I still work as a ranger in the Monongahela National Forest, but now I split my time between traditional Forest Service duties and managing what we privately call the sanctuary. People with serious illnesses sometimes find their way to the bog, guided by dreams or intuition they don't fully understand. I help them work with the plants to find healing that conventional medicine couldn't provide. Sam continues his electromagnetic research, documenting the bog's unique properties for the scientific community. His published papers describe fascinating but perfectly natural phenomena, unusual mineral deposits, rare atmospheric conditions, unique electromagnetic fields generated by underground water systems, Nothing that would bring unwanted attention from government agencies or paranormal investigators. But late at night, when the new moon makes the bog most active, I can still see the lights dancing above the water. The spirits of ancient healers, tending their eternal garden, preserving knowledge that the modern world forgot, waiting for the next generation of humans to rediscover the deep connections between all living things. The Cherokee were right about one thing. The high mountain bogs are places of power that demand respect, but they're not traps anymore. They're sanctuaries for those brave enough to approach them with genuine need and open hearts. I've been the bog's keeper for 6 months now, and I've learned things about plant medicine that no university ever taught. How to cure cancer with properly prepared wild ginger. How to heal depression using the electromagnetic fields that flow through carnivorous plants. How to help people find their way back to themselves when conventional therapy has failed. But the most important lesson is this: some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just understood. The bog will always be more than science can explain, and that's exactly as it should be. Mystery is what keeps the magic alive. Last week, I found fresh geometric plant formations appearing near the main boardwalk. New patterns I hadn't seen before, more complex than anything Mary Howling Wolf had created. When I communed with the bog's collective consciousness, asking what was happening, the answer came back in Jenny Walsh's mental voice. The garden is growing, Patty. There are other places like this, other keepers awakening to their responsibilities. The network is rebuilding itself. So maybe my work here is just the beginning. Maybe there are bog witches awakening all across Appalachia, in forgotten wetlands, where the veil between worlds grows thin. Maybe the old healing traditions are finding new guardians, people who understand that some knowledge is too important to let die. I keep detailed records now, just like any good scientist, but I write them in 2 different journals. One contains the official documentation, temperature readings, plant growth rates, electromagnetic measurements that explain everything in terms acceptable to the modern world. The other journal tells the real story, the one about lights that dance with intelligence above dark water, about plants that grow in patterns too perfect for nature, too beautiful for coincidence, about the thin places where ancient wisdom still flows like underground rivers, waiting for those who know how to listen. Sometimes, on nights when the bog is most active, I think I can hear Mary Howling Wolf's voice carried on the wind through the pine trees. She's singing old Cherokee healing songs, welcoming new spirits to the sanctuary, teaching them how to tend the growing things with love instead of fear. The witch lights of Cranberry Wilderness still burn bright in the darkness, but now they burn with invitation instead of hunger, offering sanctuary to anyone brave enough to step off the boardwalk and wade into the mysterious waters where healing grows wild and free. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough magic for one lifetime. My name is Jennifer Shadowbrook, but everyone calls me Jenny. I've been a park ranger at Shenandoah National Park for 13 years now, and I specialize in cave rescue operations. When people get lost or hurt in the underground cave systems around here, I'm the one who goes down to get them out. I've crawled through passages so narrow I had to exhale just to fit. I've rappelled down 100-foot drops into complete darkness. I've pulled injured cavers up cliff faces in the middle of winter storms. In all those years, through all those dangerous rescues, I never once believed in anything supernatural. That changed in December of 1991. The caves near Luray, Virginia, are some of the most beautiful and dangerous in the whole state. Limestone formations that took millions of years to create, underground rivers that can flood without warning, and passages that branch off into unmapped territory. During winter, when the tourist caves close down, serious cavers come from all over the country to explore the wild systems. I love my job because every day is different. One morning, I might be teaching safety classes to Boy Scout troops. The next, I could be coordinating a rescue operation for someone who's been trapped underground for 8 hours. The caves demand respect, and I've seen what happens when people don't give it. My office sits in a small ranger station about 3 miles from the main cave entrance. The building is nothing fancy, just concrete blocks painted Park Service brown, with a radio that crackles too much and a coffee maker that's older than I am. But it's home. From my desk, I can see the rolling hills that hide the entrance to over 40 miles of surveyed cave passages. That December was colder than usual. Most of the amateur cavers had given up for the season, but the serious ones were still coming through. These weren't weekend warriors with cheap headlamps and cotton clothes. These were people who understood that caves don't care about your schedule or your comfort level. The first call came in on a Tuesday morning. I was updating my rescue equipment inventory when the radio squawked to life. "Jenny, you there? This is Marcus." Marcus Limestone. Yes, that's really his name. Runs a cave guiding service out of Winchester. He's one of the most experienced cavers in Virginia. Someone who's mapped passages nobody else even knows exist. "Go ahead, Marcus. I've got something weird to report. Had a group of 4 cavers come out of the system yesterday, and they're telling some strange stories." I pulled out my incident report pad. "What kind of strange?" "They say they saw people following them through the caves, dark figures moving in the passages behind them. But here's the thing, Jenny. They were in sections where there's no other access. Nobody else was down there." I frowned. Cavers sometimes see things in the dark. When you're underground for hours, your mind can play tricks on you. Add in the stress of being in a dangerous environment, and people start seeing shadows that aren't there. Could have been their own shadows bouncing off the walls, I suggested. New cavers sometimes spook themselves. That's what I thought too. But Jenny, these weren't new cavers. Tom Bradley was the group leader. You know Tom, 25 years of experience. He's mapped more cave than you and me combined. That got my attention. Tom Bradley didn't spook easily. What exactly did they see? Human-shaped shadows moving behind them through passages. But here's the weird part. The shadows seemed to be moving on their own, independent of any light source. And get this, when they stopped to look directly at them, their headlamps would dim or go out completely. I wrote down the details, but I wasn't too concerned yet. Equipment failure happens underground all the time. Carbide lamps can be temperamental in cold weather, and even good LED headlamps can fail when you need them most. Which section were they in? The lower level, near what we call the railroad chamber. You know the area? I knew it. The railroad chamber got its name from local historians who claimed it was used as a station on the Underground Railroad. Escaped slaves supposedly hid there on their way north. I'd never paid much attention to the stories. My job was keeping people safe in the present, not worrying about the past. "I'll make a note in the log," I told Marcus. "If you get any more reports, let me know." But even as I hung up the radio, something about the report bothered me. Not the shadows, like I said. People see things underground. It was the location. The railroad chamber and the passages around it had a reputation. Local cavers called it the quiet zone because sounds seemed muffled there. Even experienced cavers avoided camping in that section. I'd been through those passages dozens of times on rescue operations. The geology was stable, the air quality was good, and there were multiple exit routes. There was nothing dangerous about the area that should make people nervous. But if I was being honest, I didn't like going through there either. Something about the place just felt heavy. Like the air itself was carrying weight from somewhere else. I shook my head and went back to my inventory. Equipment doesn't check itself, and I had real work to do. But as I counted ropes and inspected carabiners, I kept thinking about Tom Bradley. In all the years I'd known him, he'd never filed a report about anything he couldn't explain. Maybe this time was different. 2 days later, Marcus called again. This time his voice was different, tighter, more concerned. "Jenny, we've got another incident. Different group, same area." I set down my coffee mug and reached for the incident report forms. "Tell me." 3 cavers went down yesterday morning for a photography expedition. They were heading for the Crystal Gallery, but they got turned around in the lower passages near Railroad Chamber. Getting lost in caves happens more often than people think. Even with good maps and GPS units, underground navigation can be tricky. Passages that look different on the way out than they did going in, side tunnels that don't show up on surveys, equipment failure that leaves you in total darkness. Did they activate their emergency beacons? No, that's just it. They found their way out on their own. But Jenny, they're telling the same story as Tom's group. Dark figures, following them through passages where no one else should have been. I started filling out the report header. Same location, exact same area, but this time, they got pictures. That stopped me cold. Pictures? Digital camera with a good flash. They were trying to photograph some formations when they noticed movement behind them. The photographer, guy named Dave Chen, does this stuff professionally. He spun around and started shooting. What did he get? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Jenny, you need to see these yourself. Can you meet me at Murphy's Diner in Luray? I've got the photos with me. 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from Marcus in a booth that had probably been there since the 1960 seconds. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Marcus was built like most serious cavers, compact and wiry, with hands that were permanently stained from handling rope and carbide. But today he looked older than his 45 years. Before I show you these, he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket, I want you to know that Dave Chen is a professional. He does cave photography for National Geographic. He knows his equipment, and he knows how light behaves underground. He handed me 5 color photographs, still smelling like developing chemicals. The first 3 showed typical cave formations. Flowstone curtains, stalactites, the kind of beautiful underground features that make people fall in love with caving. But the 4th photo made me stop breathing. In the background, behind the formations Dave had been photographing, stood a human figure. It was dark, like a shadow, but it had clear human proportions. Head, shoulders, arms. The figure seemed to be watching the photographer from about 30 feet away. Could be another caver, I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to me. Look at the 5th one. The final photograph showed the same area from a slightly different angle. The formations were identical, the lighting was the same, but the figure was gone. According to the timestamps on the camera, the photos were taken 12 seconds apart. Dave says he was alone in that chamber, Marcus said. His 2 partners were in the passage behind him, at least 50 feet away. There's no way someone could move through that space in 12 seconds without making noise. I studied the photographs more carefully. The figure in the 4th image wasn't wearing typical caving gear. No helmet, no headlamp, no reflective clothing. It looked like someone dressed in simple, dark clothing, the kind of clothes you might have worn 150 years ago. There's something else, Marcus said. Dave says that right after he took these photos, his camera's batteries died, brand new lithium batteries that should have lasted for hours. And his headlamp dimmed to almost nothing. I set the photographs down and looked at Marcus. What do you think is happening down there? I don't know, but Jenny, I've been caving these systems for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this. That afternoon, I drove out to the cave entrance to do my own investigation. The access point for the lower levels is through a narrow opening hidden behind a screen of mountain laurel. Most tourists never even notice it, but serious cavers know it leads to some of the most spectacular formations in the region. I suited up in my standard cave gear, helmet with dual LED headlamps, sturdy clothing, emergency supplies, and my radio gear. The temperature outside was 38 degrees, but I knew it would be a constant 52 degrees underground. The entrance passage drops steeply for about 40 feet, before leveling out into a walking tunnel. I'd been through this route hundreds of times, but today felt different. Usually, I could hear water dripping, small rocks settling, the normal sounds of a living cave system. Today, everything seemed muffled. 20 minutes into my descent, I reached the junction, where the main passage splits toward either the Crystal Gallery or the lower levels near Railroad Chamber. I took the left fork, heading down toward the area where both groups had reported their encounters. The passage here narrows to about 4 feet wide, with a low ceiling that forces you to duck walk for several yards. It's not a pleasant stretch, but it opens up into a beautiful chamber filled with calcite formations that sparkle like jewels in headlamp light. As I squeezed through the narrow section, my primary headlamp flickered and went out. Equipment failure underground is serious business. I immediately stopped moving and activated my backup light. The LED came on, but it seemed dimmer than usual. I checked my battery pack. Full charge. That's when I heard the sound. Footsteps. Definitely footsteps, coming from the passage behind me. Slow, deliberate, the sound of someone walking carefully across uneven stone. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone back there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening carefully. Cave acoustics can be strange. Sounds can echo from chambers hundreds of feet away and seem like they're right next to you. But these footsteps had sounded close, maybe 30 feet behind me in the narrow passage. "This is Park Ranger Jennifer Shadowbrook," I called louder. If someone's back there, please respond. Nothing. I decided to continue forward into the main chamber. If there was another caver behind me, they would follow and we could sort out what was happening. If it was just strange acoustics, I'd complete my investigation and head back to the surface. The chamber opened up around me, and I swept my headlamp across the formations. Everything looked normal. No signs of recent human passage, no equipment left behind, no disturbance to the delicate cave environment. But as I examined the far wall, where Dave Chen would have been taking his photographs, my light caught something that made my heart skip. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the soft cave mud, leading from the passage entrance to the exact spot where the mysterious figure had appeared in the photograph. I knelt down to examine them more closely. They were definitely human footprints, but something was wrong. The prints were clear and well-defined, but they seemed to have no depth. It was as if someone had walked across the mud without actually putting weight on their feet. And then my backup headlamp went out, plunging me into absolute darkness. In 13 years of cave rescue work, I'd been in complete darkness before. It's disorienting, but not dangerous if you stay calm and follow your training. I reached for my emergency light, a small but powerful LED that I always carry as a last resort. The light came on, but before I could feel relief, I saw them. 3 human figures standing at the far end of the chamber, just at the edge of my light beam. They were dark, like shadows given form, but I could make out details, clothes that looked old-fashioned, faces that seemed somehow hollow. They were watching me. I fumbled for my radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Ranger Shadowbrook. I need backup at the railroad chamber entrance." Static. My radio was dead. When I looked up again, the figures were gone. I made it back to the surface in record time, my emergency light lasting just long enough to guide me through the passages. Once I reached daylight, I checked my equipment. Both primary lights had full battery power and worked perfectly. My radio came back to life as soon as I cleared the cave entrance. None of it made sense. That evening, I called Marcus and told him what I'd experienced. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Jenny," he said finally, "I think we need to contact someone who knows more about this kind of thing than we do." "What kind of thing? Equipment failure? I can handle equipment failure. You know that's not what this is." He was right, but I wasn't ready to admit it. I'd spent my whole career dealing with facts, geology, weather patterns, human physiology. The idea that something supernatural was happening in my caves went against everything I understood about the world. But 3 days later, we had our third incident. And this time, someone got hurt. A group of 5 experienced cavers from Maryland had gone down to survey some unmapped passages in the lower system. They were led by Sarah Martinez, a cave mapping specialist I'd worked with before. Professional, careful, the kind of person who double-checks every piece of equipment before going underground. They were supposed to be down for 6 hours. When they didn't come out after 8, I activated our emergency response protocol. I was suiting up for a search and rescue operation when I heard voices echoing from the cave entrance. 4 people emerged carrying the 5th, a young man named Kevin who was conscious but clearly in shock. "What happened?" I asked as we helped Kevin to the medical station I'd set up in the parking area. "We were in the railroad chamber," Sarah said. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. Everything was going fine until we reached the lower passage junction. That's when we started seeing them. Seeing what? People. Dark figures moving through the passages ahead of us. At first we thought it was another caving group, but they weren't using lights. They were just moving through the darkness like they could see. I checked Kevin's vital signs while Sarah continued her report. His pulse was elevated and he was cold to the touch, but there were no obvious injuries. "We tried to make contact," Sarah said. "Called out, used our lights to signal, but they kept moving away from us, always staying just at the edge of our vision." "And Kevin said he could hear them talking." "Talking? What were they saying?" Kevin looked up at me with wide eyes. They were speaking, but not in English. It sounded like singing, almost. Sad singing. And they kept motioning for us to follow them deeper into the cave system. "That's when our equipment started failing," Sarah continued. "First, our GPS units went dead, then our backup lights. We were down to 1 working headlamp between the 5 of us." "So you headed back?" "We tried to. But the passages didn't look right. Tunnels that should have led back to the surface kept leading us deeper underground. It was like the cave itself was changing around us. This was impossible. I knew those cave systems better than anyone. The passages don't change. They've been stable for thousands of years. How did you finally get out? Sarah glanced at Kevin before answering. Kevin says, one of the figures spoke to him, told him to follow a specific tunnel that we hadn't noticed before. We found it, and it led straight to the surface. But when we looked back, the tunnel was gone. I spent the next 2 hours taking detailed statements from all 5 cavers. Their stories were consistent, which was both reassuring and disturbing. If they were all lying, they'd coordinated their lies very well. If they were telling the truth, then something was happening in those caves that I couldn't explain. That night, I sat in my office reading through every incident report I'd filed over the past 13 years. I was looking for any pattern, any previous mention of unusual encounters in the railroad chamber area. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past decade, I'd filed 17 reports of equipment failure in that specific section of the cave system. Lights going out, radios failing, GPS units losing signal. I'd attributed all of these incidents to normal underground conditions: moisture, temperature changes, electromagnetic interference from the rock formations. But looking at them together, I saw something I'd missed before. Every single equipment failure had happened between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. And in 12 of the 17 reports, cavers had mentioned hearing unusual sounds or voices in the passages. I dismissed these mentions as echo effects or imagination. Now I wasn't so sure. I was still going through the files when my phone rang. It was Marcus, and he sounded scared. "Jenny, you need to get out to the cave entrance. Now." "What's wrong?" "There's something happening down there. I can see lights moving in the passages, but no one's supposed to be underground tonight." I grabbed my gear and drove to the cave entrance as fast as the winding mountain roads would allow. Marcus was waiting in the parking area with a pair of binoculars, staring at the cave opening. "Look," he said, handing me the binoculars. Deep inside the cave entrance, maybe 100 feet down the main passage, I could see a faint glow moving back and forth. It wasn't the steady beam of a headlamp or the flickering light of a carbide lamp. This light seemed to pulse and flow like water. "How long has it been doing that?" I asked. "About an hour. Jenny, I've been watching caves for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this." As we watched, more lights appeared. Dozens of them, moving through passages that should have been in complete darkness. They seemed to be gathering in the area of the railroad chamber, converging from different tunnel systems. "We need to go down there," I said. Marcus stared at me. "Are you insane?" Maybe I was. But I was also the only official Park Service representative in the area, and it was my job to investigate unusual activity in the caves. Whatever was happening down there, I needed to document it. "I'm going down. You can stay here if you want." Like hell, I'm staying up here alone. We suited up with extra equipment, multiple light sources, backup radios, emergency beacons. I also brought my camera and a voice recorder. If we were going to encounter something unexplainable, I wanted evidence. The descent started normally. Our lights worked fine, the passages were familiar, and we made good time to the junction where the main tunnel splits. But as we approached the railroad chamber, the temperature dropped noticeably. "You feel that?" Marcus whispered. I nodded. The air had become thick and heavy, like breathing through wet cotton, and there was a smell, not the usual cave smell of damp stone and organic decay, but something else. Something that reminded me of old clothes and wood smoke. That's when we heard the singing. It was faint at first, just at the edge of hearing. Human voices, definitely human, singing in harmony, but the words weren't in any language I recognized, and the melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. "Where's it coming from?" Marcus asked. The singing seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the cave system in ways that defied acoustic logic. But it was getting stronger as we approached the railroad chamber. We rounded the final bend and stopped dead in our tracks. The chamber was filled with people. Dozens of human figures moving through the space like they belonged there. Men, women, children, all dressed in simple, old-fashioned clothing. Some carried bundles or small bags. Others held the hands of smaller figures that must have been children. They were all translucent, like they were made of shadow and moonlight. but I could see their faces clearly. Tired, worried, but determined. These were people who had traveled a long distance and still had further to go. And as we watched, frozen in amazement and terror, one of the figures turned toward us. It was a woman, maybe 30 years old, with kind eyes and a head wrap that had once been white. She looked directly at me and smiled. A sad smile, but genuine. Then she raised one finger to her lips in a gesture of silence and pointed toward a passage I'd never noticed before. The passage that Kevin's group had used to escape. The woman began walking toward us, her feet making no sound on the stone floor. As she got closer, I could see more details. The careful way her dress was patched, the weariness in her eyes, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work. Behind her, the other figures had stopped their movement through the chamber. They were all watching us now, waiting to see what would happen. "Don't be afraid," the woman said, her voice echoing strangely in the cave air. "We mean no harm to those who respect this place." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you?" "We are the ones who passed through here long ago, the ones who sought freedom in the darkness when we could not find it in the light." She gestured toward the other figures. "This was our resting place, our sanctuary, when the world above offered us only chains." Marcus grabbed my arm. "Jenny, we need to go, now." But I couldn't move. Something about this woman, about all of them, held me in place. They weren't threatening, they were just sad. Deeply, profoundly sad. "Why are you showing yourselves now?" I asked. The woman's expression grew even more sorrowful. "Because they want to build above us. Machines will come, and concrete, and lights that never sleep. Our resting place will be disturbed, and we will have nowhere to gather, nowhere to remember." I didn't understand what she meant, but before I could ask, Marcus's radio crackled to life. Through the static, we could hear the voice of the park supervisor. "All units, be advised. Construction crews will begin site preparation for the new visitor center tomorrow morning. Work area includes the cave system near Luray. All personnel should avoid the area until further notice." The visitor center. I'd heard rumors about the project, but I didn't know it was actually approved. They were going to build a modern facility right above the cave systems, complete with gift shop, restaurant, and paved parking for tour buses. The woman was watching my face, reading my understanding. "You see, they will pour concrete where we once found shelter. They will bring tour groups through passages where we once hid our children. Our sanctuary will become entertainment." Around the chamber, the other figures began to move again, but now they were agitated. The singing had stopped, replaced by whispers that seemed to come from the stone walls themselves. The temperature dropped even further, and ice began to form on the cave walls. "What do you want from us?" I asked. "Help us protect this place. Help us find peace." "How?" "Oh." The woman stepped closer, and I could see through her translucent form to the rock wall behind. "Tell our story. Make them understand what happened here. Make them remember that this place is sacred ground." Suddenly, Marcus screamed. I spun around to see him backing toward the chamber wall, his headlamp beam showing nothing but empty space in front of him. But something was there. Something that wasn't quite visible but was definitely present. "It's touching me," Marcus yelled. "Something's trying to pull me into the wall." I could see it now, a dark shape, more solid than the others, reaching out toward Marcus with what looked like arms made of shadow. This figure was different from the woman and the others. Where they seemed peaceful, this one radiated anger and desperation. "He was one of the hunters," the woman said sadly. "One of those who pursued us through these passages. He died here too, crushed by falling rock as he chased a family with small children. But unlike us, he has not found peace." The dark figure was pulling Marcus toward a section of the wall where I could now see the outline of a passage, not a natural cave formation, but a crude tunnel that looked like it had been carved by hand and then sealed up. "Let him go," I shouted. The dark figure turned toward me, and I saw its face, or what remained of one, twisted with hatred and rage, barely human anymore. "He seeks to finish what he started," the woman explained, "to drag the living into his tomb, to make them pay for the freedom he could not steal." Marcus was now pressed against the wall, his feet actually sinking into the stone as if it were mud. He was trying to fight back, but his hands passed right through the dark figure. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures. the flash illuminating the chamber in stark bursts of light. The dark figure screamed, a sound like wind through broken glass, and released Marcus. He fell to the cave floor, gasping. "The light burns him," the woman said, with something that might have been approval. "He belongs to the darkness now and cannot bear to be seen clearly." I helped Marcus to his feet. He was shaking and cold, but he seemed uninjured. "We need to leave," he gasped. "Wait." The woman held up her hand. "You have seen our truth. Will you help us?" I looked around the chamber at the dozens of figures watching us with hope and desperation. These people had died seeking freedom, and now they faced having their final resting place turned into a tourist attraction. "What exactly do you need me to do?" "Stop the building. Make them understand that this place must remain undisturbed. Help us find the peace that has been denied to us for so long. And if I can't," the woman's expression grew dark, "then we will have to protect this place ourselves. And the anger of the dead is a terrible thing, Ranger. We have remained quiet for many years, but if our sanctuary is violated, we will not be quiet anymore." Around the chamber, the other figures were nodding. Even the peaceful-looking families, the children, the elderly, they all had a look in their eyes that spoke of determination beyond death. The dark figure that had attacked Marcus was still there, lurking at the edge of the light, waiting for another chance. And I realized that it wasn't the only angry spirit here. The others had simply been controlling themselves, maintaining their dignity even in death. "But if they were pushed too far, I'll do what I can," I promised. The woman smiled, and for a moment she looked almost alive again. "Thank you." The figures began to fade, becoming more and more translucent until they were just wisps of mist in the cave air. The last to disappear was the woman, who gave me one final look of gratitude before melting into the shadows. Marcus and I climbed back to the surface in silence. When we reached the parking area, he sat down heavily on a picnic table and put his head in his hands. "What the hell just happened down there?" I looked back at the cave entrance, thinking about the dozens of spirits who were still down there, waiting to see if I would keep my promise. I said slowly, "we just met some people who've been waiting a very long time for someone to listen to their story." The next morning, I was on the phone with the State Historical Society, the Park Service Regional Office, and anyone else who might be able to help me stop the construction project. I told them about the historical significance of the site, about the documented use of the caves as underground railroad stations, about the need for archaeological surveys before any building could begin. I didn't mention the spirits. By afternoon, I had managed to get a temporary halt to the construction while the Historical Society conducted a site survey. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought us time. 3 weeks later, the survey team made an announcement that changed everything. They had found clear evidence that the cave system had indeed been used as a major underground railroad station. Hidden chambers contained artifacts from the 1852. Buttons, pieces of fabric, even carved names in the stone walls. More importantly, they found human remains. Dozens of them, in a sealed passage that matched exactly where I had seen the dark figure trying to drag Marcus. The bones were those of men, women, and children who had died in the caves and never received proper burial. The construction project was permanently canceled. The site was designated as a historical landmark, and the cave system was closed to recreational caving. The remains were given a proper burial in a ceremony attended by local African American churches and historical societies. I was there when they laid the spirits to rest. As the minister spoke the final prayers over the graves, I felt a presence beside me, not threatening this time, just peaceful. When I looked, I caught a glimpse of the woman from the chamber, standing with her head bowed in gratitude. Then she was gone, and I knew she wouldn't be back. The cave system is quiet now. Oh, there's still spiritual activity down there. Other rangers have reported strange lights and distant voices. But it's different now. Protective rather than desperate, peaceful rather than angry. I still work as a cave rescue specialist, but I've expanded my duties. I'm now the unofficial historian for underground railroad sites throughout the region, and I've helped identify 3 other cave systems that were used as hiding places for escaped slaves. Sometimes, late at night, I get calls from other rangers or cavers who've encountered things they can't explain, shadows that move independently, voices singing songs in languages they don't recognize, figures dressed in old-fashioned clothes appearing in photographs. I listen to their stories, and I believe them. because I know that some places hold memory in their very stones. Some places are sacred ground, whether we recognize it or not, and some people love freedom so much that not even death can make them stop fighting for it. The caves beneath Shenandoah still echo with their voices. But now, instead of crying out in desperation, they're singing songs of rest, songs of peace, songs of a journey finally completed. I make sure those songs are never disturbed again, because that's what rangers do. We protect the places that need protecting, whether they're inhabited by the living or the dead. And in the caves beneath Virginia's mountains, sometimes there isn't much difference between the two. The shadow people of Shenandoah have found their peace. But they're still there, watching over the underground pathways that once led to freedom. And as long as I'm wearing this badge, they always will be. My name is Chris Nightwing, and I've been a river ranger at New River Gorge for 14 years. I've pulled bodies out of Class V rapids, rappelled down 300-foot cliff faces to rescue stranded climbers, and survived more close calls than I care to count. People think being a park ranger is all campfire talks and wildlife photos. They don't know about the dark stuff we see out here. I grew up in Point Pleasant, where everyone knows the Mothman stories. Red eyes in the sky, bridge collapses, prophecies of doom, tourist nonsense, I always thought. Small town folklore, to sell t-shirts and bring in the paranormal investigators. I never believed any of it until September 1989, when I found their nest. The New River is old 360 million years, they say. It carved this gorge through solid rock, creating walls so steep that sunlight only hits the bottom for a few hours each day. Down in the lower gorge, near the ghost town of Thurmond, you can feel the weight of all that time pressing down on you. The abandoned buildings sit there like broken teeth, rusting away since the coal boom died in the 1,950 seconds. That's where I patrol most days. River safety and whitewater rescue in some of the most dangerous water on the East Coast. Class V rapids that can crush a kayak like a tin can. Water so cold it'll give you hypothermia in August. My job is to keep people alive when they think they're tougher than the river. September in the gorge is usually beautiful. The heat backs off, the leaves start turning, and the tourist crowds thin out. But that September felt wrong from the start. The sunsets turned deep red, like the sky was bleeding. Bats disappeared from their usual caves. Even the fish seemed nervous, jumping at shadows in the water. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. 3 kayakers from Virginia Beach, experienced guys with good equipment, radioed for emergency pickup near Thurmond. When I found them downstream, they were shaking so hard they could barely hold their paddles. Something attacked us, the lead kayaker said. His name was Mike, and he had 20 years on the river. Flying things, huge wings, red eyes. They came out of the old coal plant and just swooped down on us. I figured they'd seen turkey vultures. We get big ones in the gorge, and they can look pretty scary if you're not expecting them. But Mike insisted these things were different, bigger, more human-like. They had hands, he said. I saw hands. I wrote it up as a wildlife encounter and forgot about it. That was my first mistake. The second call came 3 days later. A family from Ohio, floating the gentler upper section, reported the same thing. Giant flying creatures near the abandoned buildings. This time, there was physical evidence: feathers. 8-foot wingspan worth of black feathers, unlike anything I'd seen in 14 years of wildlife training. By the end of the week, 5 different groups had reported similar encounters, all near Thurmond, all describing the same impossible things: winged humanoids with glowing red eyes, attacking from the old industrial buildings. That's when I decided to investigate personally. Like I said, that was a mistake. I loaded my rescue boat with standard equipment, first aid kit, throw ropes, emergency radio, flares. I also packed my service weapon, which I'd never needed on the water before. Something about those feathers bothered me. They felt warm when I touched them, like they'd come from something still alive. The morning I headed downriver to Thurmond, every bird in the gorge went silent. The boat motor died exactly 1 mile from Thurmond, just cut out like someone had pulled the plug. I'd maintained that engine myself for 3 years. It ran perfectly. But as soon as I got close to the abandoned town, it quit. I drifted the rest of the way, using my paddle to steer through the rapids. The silence was complete. No bird calls, No insect sounds, just the rush of water over rocks. Even that seemed muffled, like the air itself was holding its breath. Thurmond sits on a narrow strip of land between the river and the cliff wall. In 1910, it housed 3,000 people. Coal trains ran through every hour, taking black gold to steel mills up north. Now it's just empty buildings and rusted rail tracks, slowly being swallowed by kudzu vines. I tied off at the old loading dock and walked into town. My footsteps echoed off the empty buildings. Windows stared down at me like dead eyes. Everything felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Then I saw the first nest. It was built in the old coal processing plant, tucked into the rafters 40 feet above the machinery. Massive thing, 10 feet across, made of twisted metal and what looked like human clothing. Old shirts, jackets, things that had been weathered by years of rain and wind. I climbed up for a closer look, using the old maintenance ladders. The metal groaned under my weight, but held. When I got to the nest level, the smell hit me musky, wild, like a zoo cage that hadn't been cleaned in months. Inside the nest were bones. Lots of them. Deer bones, dog bones, and some that looked human. Old ones, yellowed with age. At the center sat 3 eggs, each the size of a football, with shells that gleamed like black metal. That's when I heard the sound behind me. A low whoosh, like wind through fabric, but rhythmic. Wing beats. I turned around and saw it perched on the opposite rafter, 7 feet tall. Humanoid but wrong. Its skin was gray-black, stretched tight over bird-like bones. Wings folded against its back like a leather coat. And its eyes? They glowed red, bright as brake lights, and they were looking right into mine. I froze. 14 years of emergency training, and all I could do was stare. The thing tilted its head, studying me like a specimen. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget, part shriek, part human scream, echoing through the empty building. More wing beats answered from outside. Lots of them. I scrambled down those ladders faster than any safety manual would recommend, jumping the last 8 feet to the factory floor. My radio crackled with static, then cleared for just a moment. Chris, a voice I didn't recognize, speaking through the static. Get out! Get out now! They're coming for the nest. The radio went dead. I ran for the boat, crashing through rusted machinery and debris. Behind me, the building filled with those sounds, wings beating, metal scraping, and that horrible shrieking call echoing back and forth between the creatures. I made it to the dock and jumped in the boat. The engine turned over on the first try, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. As I gunned it upstream, away from Thurmond, I looked back. 5 of them stood on the dock where I'd been seconds before. Tall, winged figures silhouetted against the red sunset sky, watching me go with those burning eyes. That night, back at the ranger station, I tried to file a report. Every time I wrote down what I'd seen, it sounded crazy. Giant birdmen living in abandoned buildings, eggs in metal nests, voices on the radio, warning of danger. Instead, I wrote up a structural safety concern and recommended closing Thurmond to river access. Dangerous buildings, unstable foundations, potential for injury. All true, just not the whole truth. But I couldn't stop thinking about those bones in the nest. Some of them had been gnawed, and that voice on the radio, it had known my name. 2 days later, we found Danny Morrison. Danny was a local kayaker, 19 years old, cocky as they come, but skilled on the water. He'd ignored my recommendations and paddled down to Thurmond alone, probably looking to prove he wasn't scared of some ranger's ghost stories. We found him suspended from the old railroad bridge, 100 feet above the water. No rope, no climbing gear, just hanging there like he'd been dropped from the sky. His kayak was floating empty downstream, paddle gone, spray skirt torn clean off. The official report said he'd suffered massive trauma consistent with a fall. What it didn't mention was the claw marks on his shoulders, or the fact that his body was completely drained of blood. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with oversized vultures. I couldn't investigate alone anymore. If these things had killed Danny, they were beyond what one ranger could handle. I needed backup, and I needed someone who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. Linda Bridges had been my partner for 3 years. Former military police, tough as nails, and the best swiftwater rescue specialist in the state. If anyone could handle the truth about Thurmond, it was her. I told her everything over coffee at the station, the nests, the creatures, Danny's death. She listened without interrupting, which was Linda's way. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know how this sounds," she finally said. "I know. But the evidence is circumstantial at best." She leaned back in her chair. "But Danny Morrison is dead, and something killed him. If there's a pack of wild animals nesting down there, we need to deal with it." Wild animals. It was easier for both of us to think of them that way. We planned a full investigation for the next morning. Proper equipment, this time climbing gear, flares, backup radios, and both our service weapons. We'd document whatever was in those buildings and call in animal control or wildlife management as needed. The boat made it to Thurmond without any engine trouble. In daylight, the ghost town looked almost normal, just old buildings falling apart in the woods. It was hard to believe anything supernatural could exist in such an ordinary place. We split up to cover more ground. Linda took the old company store and depot buildings on the north side. I went back to the coal plant where I'd found the first nest. The nest was bigger now. They'd added to it, weaving in more metal and cloth. Fresh bones scattered the floor below a deer carcass that couldn't have been there more than a day. And the eggs were gone. "Chris, you need to see this." Linda's voice crackled over the radio. I found her in the depot building, staring up at the walls. They were covered in scratches, deep gouges carved into the wood and metal. But these weren't random marks. They formed patterns, almost like writing. "Territorial markings?" I suggested. "Maybe. But look at this." She led me to the back wall, where the scratches were deepest. Among the pattern of marks, I could make out shapes that looked almost like letters. Words. Maybe, in a language I didn't recognize. That's when the lights went out. Not electrical lights, we were in an abandoned building with no power. The daylight just dimmed. Like clouds had covered the sun, except when I looked outside, the sky was clear. "Movement on the roof," Linda whispered, pointing up. Heavy footsteps crossed overhead, too heavy for any bird. The ceiling creaked under the weight. Then more footsteps joined the first, and more. A whole group walking back and forth above us. "Back door," I mouthed, pointing toward the rear exit. We crept through the building, trying to stay quiet. The footsteps followed us, moving from room to room overhead, always staying directly above our position. Like they could see through the ceiling. We made it to the back door. Linda reached for the handle. A shadow fell across the doorway from outside, something big blocking the light. Linda jerked her hand back as claws scraped against the other side of the door. "Window," I whispered. The depot's side window was small, but we could squeeze through. I boosted Linda up first, then followed. We dropped into the narrow alley between buildings, hearts pounding. "The boat," Linda said. But when we looked toward the dock, one of them was standing next to our boat, 7 feet tall, wings folded, head turned in our direction, watching. "They're hurting us," I realized, keeping us away from the water. More shapes moved between the buildings. At least 6 of them, positioning themselves to cut off our escape routes. They moved with purpose, intelligence. This wasn't animal behavior. The radio tower, Linda pointed to a rusted transmission tower on the hill behind town. Higher ground, better radio signal. We ran for it, crashing through underbrush and abandoned equipment. Behind us, those wingbeat sounds filled the air. But they weren't chasing us, they were following, keeping pace, playing with us. Halfway up the tower, my radio came alive with static. Through the noise, I heard voices. Multiple voices, speaking in overlapping whispers. "Turn back. Leave this place. You've seen too much." "They're growing stronger." Linda heard them too. Her face had gone pale, but her jaw was set in that stubborn line I knew well. "Military frequency," she said, checking her radio. "But no one should be broadcasting on this channel." At the top of the tower, we had a clear view of Thurmond. What we saw made my blood run cold. There were dozens of them. Not just the 6 we'd seen, but 30 or more, moving through the abandoned buildings like they owned the place. Some perched on rooftops, others walked upright through the streets. A few glided between structures on massive wings. And in the center of town, where the old town square used to be, they'd built something new. A large structure made of twisted metal and stone, rising 3 stories high. It looked almost like a church. If churches were built by nightmares, it's a colony, Linda breathed. They're not just nesting here. They're building. That's when they all looked up at us. 30 pairs of red eyes, glowing in the afternoon shadow, all focused on our position at the top of the tower. And as one, they started to fly. We climbed down that tower faster than should have been possible. The metal rungs cut into our hands, but we didn't slow down. Above us, the air filled with the sound of wings, a thunder of leather and bone that seemed to shake the earth. "The mine shaft," Linda shouted over the noise. "Old coal mine on the south ridge. They can't follow us underground." The mine entrance was a black hole carved into the hillside, sealed with rusted bars that had long since fallen away. We squeezed through the gap just as the first of them landed on the tower we'd abandoned. Inside, our flashlight beams cut through absolute darkness. The tunnel stretched ahead of us, carved through solid rock by miners who'd been dead for decades. Our footsteps echoed in the empty space. "This leads to the old company town," I said, remembering the maps from ranger training. "Comes out about 2 miles upstream. We can reach the backup boat from there." We walked in silence for maybe 10 minutes before Linda stopped. "Chris, look at the walls." I turned my light where she was pointing. The mine walls were covered in the same claw marks we'd seen in the depot, deep gouges carved into solid rock. But these were old, decades old, worn smooth by time. "They've been here longer than we thought," Linda said. The tunnel branched ahead of us. I checked my compass, trying to remember the layout of the old mine system. Left led to the company town. Right led deeper into the mountain. "We go left," I said. But Linda was staring down the right tunnel. "There's light down there." She was right. A faint red glow came from somewhere deep in the mountain. Not electric light, something else. Something that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Linda, no, we stick to the plan." But she was already walking toward the glow. 5 minutes. "I just want to see." I followed. Because leaving your partner alone in a situation like this isn't an option. The tunnel sloped downward, leading deeper into the earth. The red light grew stronger as we walked. The tunnel opened into a natural cavern, massive and domed like a cathedral, and in the center, glowing with that pulsing red light, was the source. Eggs, hundreds of them, arranged in perfect spirals across the cavern floor, each one the size of a watermelon, shells gleaming like black metal. Some were cracked, empty. Others moved slightly, as if something inside was stirring. "It's a nursery," Linda whispered. At the far end of the cavern, something much larger watched us. 15 feet tall, with wings that could span a highway. Its eyes burned like searchlights in the darkness. This wasn't one of the offspring we'd been seeing. This was the parent. The original, the Mothman. It spoke, and its voice filled the cavern like rolling thunder. But I understood every word. "You should not have come here." I found my voice. "You're killing people. My children need to feed, to grow strong. Your kind has forgotten the old agreements." "What agreements?" "Stay away from our places. Do not disturb our young. In return, we do not hunt in your towns." Its head tilted, studying us. "But you came anyway. You saw the nests. You learned too much." Linda stepped forward, her hand moving toward her weapon. "We're leaving. Now." The Mothman's eyes flared brighter. "No. The young ones told me of your interference. You must be dealt with." That's when I understood. The voices on the radio, the way they'd herded us, the strategic positioning around town. These things could see the future. Not perfectly, but enough to plan ahead, to know what we would do before we did it. "They can see time differently," I said to Linda. "That's how they always seem to be one step ahead." "Then how do we fight something that knows what we're going to do?" The answer came to me from growing up in Point Pleasant, from all the Mothman stories I'd dismissed as folklore. In every tale, the creature appeared before disasters. It didn't cause them, it was drawn to them. It was attracted to death and chaos. "We don't fight it," I said. "We give it what it wants." I pulled a flare from my pack and held it high. "You want disaster? You want death?" I pointed the flare toward the ceiling of the cavern, where centuries of gas accumulation from the old mine workings had collected. "I'll give you the biggest disaster this mountain's ever seen." The Mothman's eyes widened. For the first time, it looked uncertain. "You destroy this place, you destroy your children," it said. "I know, and you know I'll do it because you can see the future. You can see me lighting this flare." Linda understood immediately. She pulled out her own flare, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "Your choice. Let us leave, or we all die together." The creature stood frozen, caught between protecting its young and stopping us. Its precognitive ability had become a weakness, It could see multiple futures, but couldn't tell which one we would choose until we made the decision. Go, it said finally. But know that my children will remember your scent, your faces. They will find you. We backed out of the cavern slowly, flares ready. In the tunnel, we ran like hell. The company town entrance was exactly where the old map said it would be. We emerged into daylight and didn't stop running until we reached the emergency boat. I kept moored at the old lumber camp. As we pulled away from shore, heading upstream toward the main ranger station, I looked back one last time. Dark shapes circled the mountain where the mine entrance lay hidden, waiting. The official report was simple: structural instability in the abandoned Thurmond area, with multiple buildings at risk of collapse. The National Park Service closed the lower gorge to all recreational access, pending a full engineering survey that would never be completed. Linda put in for a transfer to Shenandoah the following month. She never said why, but I understood. Some things change you, and you can't go back to pretending the world is what you thought it was. I stayed. Someone had to monitor the situation, and I was the only one who knew the truth about what lived in those mountains. The rangers who came after me were told about unstable buildings and dangerous wildlife, close enough to the truth to keep people safe. But the Mothman's children didn't stay contained in Thurmond. Over the next few years, reports started coming in from other abandoned industrial sites throughout Appalachia. Old steel mills in Pennsylvania, closed textile factories in Virginia. Anywhere humans had built something, then left it to rot, the winged creatures seemed to follow. They were smart, adaptive. They learned to avoid areas with too many people, too much light, too much activity. But in the forgotten places, the empty places where industry had died and nature hadn't yet reclaimed the land, they thrived. I became something between a ranger and a researcher, documenting sightings and keeping track of their expansion. The official channels wouldn't listen to reports of cryptid colonies, but I built a network of park rangers, local sheriff's departments, and state wildlife officials who'd seen things they couldn't explain. We called ourselves the Appalachian Watch, though it was never anything formal, just people who understood that some territories belonged to things that weren't entirely natural. The rules were simple. Stay away from abandoned industrial sites during red sunsets. Report any sightings of large winged figures to local authorities. Never investigate alone, and if you found evidence of nesting activity, call for immediate evacuation of the area. It worked, mostly. The death toll dropped to almost zero once people knew what to avoid. But every few years, someone would ignore the warnings. Urban explorers looking for the perfect abandoned building photo. Paranormal investigators hoping to capture evidence. Teenagers on dares. We'd find them hanging from impossible heights, drained of blood, with claw marks on their shoulders. The worst part was the children. The Mothman's children kept evolving. Each new generation was smarter, stronger, more adaptable than the last. They learned to mimic human voices with disturbing accuracy. They figured out how to interfere with radio and cellular signals. Some reports suggested they could influence human behavior, drawing victims to remote locations. And they remembered faces. The original Mothman had kept its word about that. I moved my home address 3 times in 5 years. Changed my phone number twice. But sometimes, on foggy nights when the visibility was poor, I'd catch glimpses of red eyes in my peripheral vision. Shapes on rooftops that shouldn't be there. Shadows that moved wrong. They never attacked me directly. But the message was clear. They knew where I was, and they hadn't forgotten our confrontation in the mine. 14 years later, I'm still here at New River Gorge, though I'm thinking about retirement. The younger rangers don't understand why I'm so strict about safety protocols in abandoned areas. They think I'm paranoid, overly cautious. Maybe that's better. Maybe each generation needs to discover its own monsters. But if you're ever traveling through Appalachia and you see an old industrial building standing empty against the sunset sky, remember this story. Remember that some territories don't belong to us anymore. And if you see red lights moving in those shadows, don't investigate. Just drive away and don't look back. Because the children of the Mothman are still out there, still growing stronger, still claiming new territory in the forgotten places of America. And they're always watching for the next person who gets too close to their nests. My name is Chris Nightwing, and this is my warning. Listen to it and stay alive.